There you are. Senator Waters, you are recognized.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I am Senator David Waters from District 4, introducing Senate Bill 12 relative to the leasing of seasonal camp lots by the Fish and Game Department. I'm introducing this bill on behalf of the Fish and Game Commission. What it essentially does is to maintain that their handling of state leases will be consistent with other agencies, with a language in RSA 439D4, which establishes state leases shall not be more than 5 years. The current language in 21210B1 mandates that any lease for buildings or lands that is longer than a cumulative period of 30 days must be administered in accordance with RSA 440, which, if you looked at it, entails a multi-layered and lengthy process of approval, including governor and council in some cases, and an $1,100 administrative charge to the lessee for each renewal of the lease. This proposed change to 21210B will have the language mirror that which exists in 439, which allows for other properties state leases of up to 5 years before needing approval of the governor and council and a long-range capital planning committee. So there's consistency that will be introduced there. Additionally, under RSA 21210A, the department manages the seasonal camp lease program for the Connecticut Lakes Natural Area in the North Country. These leases are also allowed for up to 5 years and do not require the process under RSA 440. So again, consistency. This proposal adds a new paragraph to 3 to RSA 21210B with language similar to what is in RSA 21210A and specifically targets seasonal camp lots. So if Fish and Game is going to be leasing it, it's going to be consistent for both kinds of properties. As mentioned, these changes are consistent with how our agencies manage seasonal camp lots and will allow the department to consider future properties that have existing camps while streamlining department efforts for regulating these leases and provide a more efficient approach for managing the renewals. We've got Dan Bergeron, Chief of Wildlife and Fish and Game, and Betsy McNaughton, the land agent for the office, for the department, here to answer any questions of the committee. But it's hard for me to imagine how anybody could offer a clear explanation I've just given, but it's possible. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Glad to take any questions.
Any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Dan Bergeron from Fish and Game, in support, wishing to speak.
Good morning. Morning. You okay?
Yes. Yeah. Good morning, Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Dan Bergeron. I'm the Chief of the Wildlife Division for the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department, here representing the department and the commission in support of SB 12. I agree with Senator Waters. He did a great job at explaining that, so I'll actually probably make my testimony a little bit briefer than I had planned because he'd covered most of my points. The main goal of this really is to make the RSAs consistent for us, consistent with other agencies, and to streamline this process. Currently, the department operates under 2 different sets of RSAs for how we deal with these camp leases. One for our Connecticut Lakes natural area, which again has the 5-year language, and then the other, which Senator Waters had referenced for other properties, which is these cumulative of more than 30 days. Really, this would bring us into consistency with our sister agencies and other existing RSAs. So again, RSA 439D, which allows New Hampshire DOT and New Hampshire DES to enter into 5-year leases, as well as RSA 227H9, which gives DNCR the authority to enter into camp leases for a 5-year period. And also, as Senator Waters had mentioned, 21210A, which is for department lands on the Connecticut Lakes Natural Area. The department currently only has 5 seasonal camp leases on our properties. We have a 6th on the Glover property, which is in Dummer, New Hampshire, which is a property the department is in the process of purchasing. We don't really seek out properties with seasonal camps on them, Although we also don't want that to prevent us from purchasing valuable conservation land. There's a long heritage in the North Country of these seasonal camps. So we would like to be able to maintain them and maintain that tradition, as well as conserving priority conservation land. We feel that this bill would do that for us. It would bring us into consistency with existing RSAs and other state agencies on how they deal with these leases. And it would streamline the process, allowing the department to uphold its mission while also preserving the legacy and the heritage of these seasonal camps in the northern part of the state. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions. And as Senator Waters mentioned, we also have Betsy McNaughton here, who's our land agent, who could also answer questions. Thank you.
Questions from the committee? Well done.
Thank you.
Yeah, you are dismissed. Thank you, Dan. Let's see, Marty is in favor, but not wishing to speak. Betsy McNaughton from Fish and Game wishes to speak.
Oh, I'm here for any questions that you may have.
Okay.
I think Dan and Senator Waters did a wonderful job. I don't think I can add anything more.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Anybody in the public want to talk about this? Else, we're all set? We're all in agreement. Excellent. Great. So we will close the hearing on this. Got a minute. You want to exec it?
Exec.
All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Seeing none. Comments? Motions?
Ought to pass. I move ought to pass.
I'll second.
Further comments? Seeing none. All in favor of ought to pass?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Seeing none. Well done. All right.
Oh, we can't do it, sorry.
So move out of exec.
So you want to take it out?
Senator Waters is taking that out. Motion to move out of exec. All in favor, say aye. Any opposed? Seeing none. Thank you. That's how efficient this committee works. All right. I
Do we want it to go on consent?
can't. So I got 1 minute before we start the next one, or? 9:15 is when we'll start the next one. Coffee break.
What?
9:15. It's only 9.
Holy moly, that clock's wrong.
Oh my gosh, the clock is wrong. All right, so in 5 more minutes, we'll do the other one, and I'll be right back.
See, this one's yours, right? The next one?
I'm gonna-
All right, good morning.
Are we
It's,
talking energy?
Seeing nine, it's 9:15. It is the Energy Committee. I got the wrong bill in front of me now. I do. Sorry. I blame Senator Waters. He gave me another bill to read. Okay, there we are. Welcome, Senator Avard. We'll recognize you to introduce Senate Bill 40.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members. For the record, I'm Senator Kevin Avard, prime sponsor of SB 40. This bill is regarding net metering for New Hampshire small hydro facilities and it amends an existing law which needs to be clarified so that the law can actually be implemented. The underlying law was passed in 2021 with bipartisan support as part of SB 91 after careful review by the Senate and the House. SB 91 and SB 315 relative to municipal net meterings was signed into law by the governor and at a ceremony in August of 2021. This bill will level the playing field and remove a barrier for two small hydro generators here in New Hampshire so that they can net meter and deliver the savings. All other small hydro generators in New Hampshire are under 5 megawatts and are allowed to participate in net metering, except for two. With SB 40, we'll be able to fix that. We thought we got it right in 2021, but SB 40 will finally clarify some of the technical issues so that there's some remaining, so that these two remaining hydros can participate in the net metering and can help lower some of the energy rates. SB 40 fits in with the Senate Republicans' platform, of course, and with Democrats as well, to help working families with the rising cost of energy. And this bill also supports bipartisan goals of taking a small step towards greater energy independence using local electricity to serve local consumers. In this case, we're talking about government consumers. This bill will help make power for small hydros available to serve cities, towns, schools, and other political subdivisions with group net metering and local produced power. This will mean savings for New Hampshire at a time of very high bills and inflation. I ask you for your support of passing this bill, SB 40, and if you have any detailed questions about this bill, there are folks behind me who are a heck of a lot smarter than me that can answer a lot of these questions.
Thank you, Senator. Any questions? Senator Waters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator. So, you know, I do have a memory, and we thought we'd fix this, didn't we?
We did.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I thank you for not letting me put my foot in my mouth in committee of conference. But this is a bipartisan bill, and we're definitely in agreement, as you can see, even with the co-sponsorships of this bill. So I look forward to passing it. But if there's any technical questions, we have some people here to testify.
Any further questions? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we will have Heidi Kroll and Steve Zaretti. Is that correct? Yes. All right, come on up.
All right, you have the floor.
Thank you.
I'm back in charge.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you very much for having us here this morning. For the record, my name is Heidi Kroll. I work at Gallagher, Callahan, and Gartrell, and I'm here today on behalf of Brookfield Renewable, as well as Monadnock Paper Mills, and with me is Steve Zaretti, Senior Policy Director, Government Affairs with Brookfield Renewable. As Senator Avard indicated, this bill is intended to amend and clarify existing law, RSA 362-A:9, Roman 20. As he indicated, we thought we had fixed some problems back with the passage of SB 91 back in 2001, along as you mentioned, the same time that that bill was passed, we passed the group net metering, municipal group net metering law as well. So very quickly, the issue that we're trying to address is that at these two hydro sites, both are located at paper mills, actually. Behind the meter, there are multiple small-scale hydro facilities that were constructed literally decades ago to serve these mills. And the issue is that they are all feed into the mill, and that the mill is the single point of interconnection with the electric grid. And years ago, when we passed net metering and group net metering, and both in the case of Monadnock and then later with Brookfield, when we passed the municipal net metering, in talking with Eversource, their concern and what they were seeking for clarity was that they said, well, it's really hard for us to tell whether there are multiple hydro facilities behind this single interconnection point, or whether it would just, in theory, it could just be one larger hydro facility that would exceed the cap for net metering. And so basically this in SB 91 was intended just to kind of level the playing field, address this issue of legacy wiring, which is essentially what we are dealing with these very old mills. We thought we had that figured out after the passage of SB 91. When we went back to Eversource, they realized that there was additional clarification that they were looking for. At both sites, in the case of Brookfield, some of the hydro facilities are below 5 megawatts. There are 6 total. 4 of them are below 5 megawatts. 2 are slightly above 5 megawatts. And so there was an interest in making sure that we just had a very clear system for segregating out the ineligible generation that would be coming from those hydro facilities. First and foremost, they're there at the White Mountain Paper site to serve the load at that paper mill. And so we're talking about any excess generation. Similarly, at the Monadnock Paper Mill site, in addition to having their 3 small hydros, each of which are well below a megawatt, they have on-site steam, an on-site steam turbine that runs off of waste heat from the paper mill. And similarly, Eversource just wanted to be very crystal clear that there was, even though that doesn't run when the mill is not running, but nonetheless just to make clear that there's a methodology to segregate out anything that would be ineligible. So that, there's a lot of words on the page in SB 40, but that's because we did work, we spent several phone calls and emails exchanges with Eversource to work through the details and make sure that we had addressed all of their concerns about dotting I's, crossing T's. And the other thing I would say about this is that it's both the original law and the amendments that we made are very narrowly crafted to address existing hydro facilities that came online before a date certain. We're only aware of these 2 facilities in New Hampshire that have this problem and that have essentially been not allowed to participate in net metering like all other similarly situated small hydros that are 5 megawatts or less. So I'll turn it over to Steve to say a little bit more, but we're happy to answer questions after.
Thanks, Heidi. Good morning. Steve Zaretti with Brookfield. I think Heidi explained the situation accurately. I think what I would note is that the language is deliberately not prescriptive in identifying what methodology will be utilized to realize sort of the eligible or ineligible supply. That is a directive that will require DOE's review and approval. So this is sort of allowing for that process to kick off without, establishing it in statutes or deferring to the experts on the issue for that piece. The other issue really is the fact that we are not, Brookfield or the stations themselves, the customer at the point of interconnection. That is the result of this legacy wiring we see. So it's the mill that's the customer. And so we need to provide some language that allows for us to participate while not being the customer at the point of interconnection. But as Heidi describes, it's a very narrow situation. There's only 2 examples that we're aware of that would ever apply, given the date that's established in the initial statute itself. So happy to answer any questions.
And I'll just follow up on that because I know when you hear from the Department of Energy, that is still a concern that they have, that the customer of record at the point of interconnection in the case of the Brookfield situation is the White Mountain Paper Mill and not Brookfield. We will say that this is kind of a classic net metering arrangement where you have hydro facilities or any sort of on-site renewable generation, first and foremost serving the load that's on-site, in this case, White Mountain Paper. They have priority, they have a power purchase agreement with Brookfield. They have priority on the power. Whatever their power needs are will be served first by the hydro facilities that are there, and it will only be any excess generation that the mill does not require that would be going onto the grid and eligible for net metering. And in the case of Brookfield, it would be eligible for municipal group net metering. As we know, we passed House Bill 315 in 2021 to serve municipalities, schools, counties. It was later amended to include the state. So that would be any sales to those customers would be direct savings for taxpayers in terms of their electric bills. And more generally speaking, I mean, group net metering is often called virtual net metering, and that is because the customer and the set of customers and the generator are separate and even at separate locations. So we see it being very consistent with policy that the legislature has had on the books in the case of net metering for many, many years, and group net metering as well.
Well said. Senator Waters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning.
Good morning.
So, we went through this last year, as I mentioned to the chairman earlier. And in the governor's signing of Senate Bill 91, that was certainly an expression of support for the work that we had done and his kind of long-term support for hydroelectric generation. Is that your indication? And you don't think anything's changed about this clarification in terms of the governor, that this is kind of what we thought we had done last time, but needed some clarification?
This is exactly, we're just, as I indicated, we're just trying to clarify what was already put on the books in a very bipartisan way with support from the governor at that signing ceremony. He has indicated support for hydro. It is a baseload renewable, obviously has some seasonal variation, but run of river, as long as the river is running, at an adequate flow, the hydro is producing 24/7. Yes, and like I said, it is eligible for, in the case of Brookfield, eligible for the municipal group net metering, which he also signed at that signing ceremony.
Yeah, and I just highlight that this is something that ultimately, when we were drafting the initial legislation, we couldn't have anticipated. It came to light as we looked to enroll the projects. But Eversource has been very cooperative, very collaborative throughout, and I think this has been now over a year conversation, and we feel like this language does accomplish everything that we need it to at this point.
If I could follow up. And you mentioned Eversource, and that really is going to be my second question, is that, we did a lot of work last time with Eversource and utilities to make sure that we got it right, and that you're expressing in full confidence that Eversource has participated in this language and this is good, and that and it would be fair to say that willingness of the utilities to work on SB 91 as well as 315 and now on this indicates that kind of consensus certainly is what would have contributed to the governor's support too.
Sure, and I don't want to speak on behalf of Eversource specifically, but I can just speak to the conversations we've had, which have, like I said, been very collaborative and supportive. So,
thank you.
And this language is slightly different from language in the past, and that is because we have Eversource proposed some changes, and we agreed with those and accepted those. So those are reflected in this draft.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Pro.
Thank you for being here today and taking my question. You've touched on this, and I think you've covered it, but I really want to just confirm that I'm understanding that we are not opening up the gate for any new facility to be built. Everything has to be any facility that was prior to July 1st. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, that's exactly the initial statute that's in place that we're amending here ties it to that July, I think 2021 date. So anything that would look to participate in this would have to be an existing facility that's a hydro facility that's under the generating capacity limits of the program. So there's a number of layers that limit this entirely to what we believe is just the two sites, Brookfield in our case and Monadnock Paper.
Would this allow one of the current facilities to increase their output and still comply under this new language?
Not as drafted. You'd really have to keep it under that 5 megawatt
Okay.
limitation. So
Thank you.
there's no anticipation that would change.
Excellent.
That's,
Thanks.
that's another condition early on listed in the legislation, that it has to be at or below the capacity eligibility requirements set forth in RSA 362-A:1a. So yes.
Any further questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you very much for your
Thank you.
testimony.
Thank you.
And Josh Elliott, Department of Energy.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. For the record, Josh Elliott, Director of the Division of Policy and Programs for the New Hampshire Department of Energy. The Department of Energy is opposed to this bill as it's currently drafted, and our objections really boil down to one line, and I would direct you to page 1, lines 12 through 14, which reads, "And shall be eligible as a customer generator as a matter of law without regard to whether such hydroelectric generator is an electric utility customer, account of record at the point of interconnection to the electric grid." I will say the rest of the language that is changed in this bill, the department has no objections to, whether it's the discussion of the energy storage facilities as well as the proposed method for verifying the output of the generation behind the meters. As the folks from as Heidi Kroll, as well as the folks from Brookfield sort of explained the general metering situation where there's a legacy situation between the existing hydroelectric dams through a third party. This is White Mountain Paper in this instance. That is really where we have, our objection isn't to how to appropriately net meter that electricity. It's that definition of customer generator. So as you know, as part of net metering, customer generator, in theory that they're both consuming the electricity as well as generating it, as they're the customer of the utility. And we feel that this change fundamentally undermines that definition in statute. I would point out that there is, unlike the Monadnock Paper situation, which we've heard discussed today, this is not just a cleanup change from that prior piece of legislation. The department views this as a significant departure from current policy. That this is not just a technical cleanup. This is not just catching something that was left out. There is a significant policy decision that's here in changing that definition of customer generator. I will say this situation would be entirely rectifiable as far as the department's concerned with amending that PPA with White Mountain Paper. So there would be no legislative change needed. If you were to strike that language, the balance of the bill could remain intact. Then Brookfield could then negotiate that PPA with White Mountain Paper to include these sorts of provisions included as part of it, and then the bill would be fine, and there would be no need to change that customer generator language. The fundamental issue is that it opens a door, right? In the circumstance of this legislation, they are correct. It is very circumscribed as far as the department's concerned or is aware of. They would only impact the Brookfield renewable hydro generation facilities on the Androscoggin River up north. However, by changing that definition of customer generator, even if it's just in this statute, you open the door for other generators to come in to try to have some similar sort of either arrangements or deals, and you start slowly chipping away at that definition of customer generator. This is just another piece that's taken out, another piece, another piece, another piece. And then net metering, which is intended to allow for renewable generation or other types of generation at the customer level, to be able to add more electricity back to the grid in net metering. You just, all of a sudden that definition gets eroded enough, and all of a sudden you just have generators who are just otherwise would be participating in the wholesale markets getting paid at net metering rates. So essentially it's sort of these, it's little step, little step, little step, little step as time goes on of where you undermine that definition. Again, this whole issue can be solved with just a renegotiation or an agreement. I'm not aware or privy of the status of the PPA between the two entities. That language, all of these changes, all the issues that they're talking about can be addressed through that PPA. And then the balance of the language can remain the same. The department and Eversource will go through their process to ensure that only the appropriate amount of power is properly attributable to that net metering tariff, and that other larger generation behind the meter is not also being metered at the same tariff.
Senator Waters with a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Josh. So I kind of hear what you're saying, but I'm not sure in my reading of the bill that your fears are correct. So you've got it in front of you, right?
Yes.
All right. So line 10, that phrase, such a hydroelectric generator, okay? Now, that phrase would refer up to what begins on line 3, right? It's not just saying any generator, it's saying such a generator. So if we go back up to lines 3 through 10, look at the way that's circumscribed, okay? It says before July 1st, 2021, it says that it's at the capacity as is defined here. So I really don't see how this is applicable to any other situation that would quote unquote erode the definition of customer generator, because I think that phrase, such a hydroelectric generator, then and shall be eligible, so on, is very narrowly constrained. So I guess I'm not sure. I don't understand what you're saying.
Thank you for the question. I will clarify. So this bill, as it's currently constructed, we believe only applies to the situation that between Brookfield and White Mountain Paper with those hydroelectric facilities. Our concern is about defining these types of entities as customer generators, because they're at a fundamental level, they are not a customer of the utility, right? They're behind the meter. White Mountain Paper is actually the customer. By undermining that definition of customer generator, it sets a precedent going forward. In this circumstance, it does not change. By passing this law, if you were to pass this just as it currently sits, the only impact would be to that one company and for their one generation assets.
John, I mean, if I may, Mr. Chairman. So, but if you said that it is just for this, you agree to that.
Yes.
How does it in any way become precedential?
Because there's the next type of either a company, whether it's a solar, whether it's whatever torpid generation asset says, okay, well, we have a slightly different arrangement. We want to get paid for the net metering rate, and maybe net meter, maybe not net meter, and then it sort of sets a precedent of other utility or other generation assets.
How would it be a precedent if it's not allowed in statute? Because wouldn't they have to come and have a statute change because they would not qualify under this language?
That is correct. They would still have to come. They would still have a statute change. But by changing the definition of customer generator, you set the precedent that definition can be further and further enlarged until you're separating out the customer side of it further and further out.
Yeah. If I just may say, I just don't see how something that does not set a precedent sets a precedent. So I really am I'm confused by that, because we have to deal in what is factual and legal, not what might be surmised. Isn't that the case?
That is the case, yes. As the legislature, you have the purview and you can change the definition as you see fit. The department's concern is that this then sets a precedent for other entities to come back to further erode that definition of customer generator. So it's a little bit here, it's a little bit there, it's a little bit there. Steps keep taking further and further along down the line in order to erode that definition. So by this bill in and of itself, no, but it's the first step further down the road of eroding that definition. So by my saying that, I'm just clarifying that this is not just a technical fix or a slight tweak to the existing statute. There is a significant policy decision being made here in terms of what a customer generator is.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just would note that the testimony has confirmed that this bill in itself does not set a precedent. Thank you.
Questions? So, with basically then, if we do not pass this with this language, then they're pretty much left in limbo again. And all that power that, you know, we're hoping they can take advantage of is just, it's, let's just say they can't take advantage of it the way we were originally designed for the local generation to do, in essence. I'm just kind of at a loss, basically, where we're going with it, because, like you said, it's not setting a precedence, but it's setting a precedence, or it's setting something up for future, but they still have to go through the same process that we're going through now, and it has to be validated through what we're doing here. It's not like it's, hey, it's a quick fix. You know, this I don't know, I don't even know how to ask the question. I'm kind of at a loss, to be honest with you. So if it's not setting a precedent, and yet at the same time, it's encouraging other people to do the same thing, have at it. Let's go through the mill. Let's see what you can do. Convince us. But at this time, I mean, it seems like we're right now, we've got high energy costs. We're struggling to find new ways to generate. And in my humble opinion, I think we need more generation in this state. And I think, we're looking for solutions. And this seems like we're setting up another roadblock.
No, so sorry, let me back up. It does set a precedent in terms of changing the definition of customer generator. You will change the definition of customer generator to somebody who is not a customer. That is the precedent that's being set. Now, as Senator Waters, as you pointed out, the legislature can do whatever it sees fit in terms of policy decisions. It can decide, this is as far as we're going, and now we're stopping here. My point in highlighting this is to say that this is just not a technical fix, that there is a significant policy decision that's being made here. In terms of your question about what can be done going forward, honestly, if that line is struck, the balance of the bill is fine. It works. All that Brookfield would need to do would be to renegotiate that PPA with White Mountain Paper. And that's all that would need to be done. You don't change the definition of customer generator. The department doesn't have any issues. We can certainly abide by and do the appropriate mechanisms as they're spelled out in the rest of the statute, or the proposed statute, excuse me. That's the department's only objection is to that definition, changing that definition of customer generator. Now, if it is the will of the legislature to make that change to the definition of customer generator, it's certainly within the purview of the legislature to make that definitional change, but I just wanted to highlight again that you are making a significant policy decision here. Now, whether or not you want to make that policy decision, again, it's up to you, but to be made aware that you are making a policy decision here.
Well, that's why we're here.
Exactly, that's why you're here.
Yeah. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you,
Any
Senator.
further questions? Seeing none. Let's see. We have Mike Licata, Eversource, in support, wishing to speak.
Good morning.
You have the floor.
Thank you. For the record, Michael Licata representing Eversource Energy, coming before you in support of the bill. We feel that this legislation provides necessary and important clarifications on the metering arrangements to enable these two hydroelectric facilities to take advantage of net metering as authorized in 2021 by Senate Bill 91. Be very brief. We appreciate the opportunity to work with stakeholders to address really technical and clerical issues that we had with the previous language. We feel what's before you is a good bill. It provides the necessary clarity so we understand our role, the generators understand their role in terms of who is responsible for metering and compensation. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions the committee may have.
Questions from the committee? Senator Bertzel.
Thank you, and thank you for taking my question. So the question I have, so this is this not already an existing generator producing electricity?
That is correct.
And will this actually incentivize, do you feel this will actually incentivize people to do additional generation?
No, I don't believe that this would, and there are others who can probably speak better to this, but this is really designed to address how the existing generators at these two hydroelectric facilities, which are behind the meter, the retail meters of paper mills, the meters are read. That information is conveyed to the utility, and then the utility compensates the customer. So it is really quite narrowly drafted.
Thank you.
Senator Waters.
Thank you. So, and thank you, Michael. And you heard the previous kind of conversation over precedent, over change, and as a actual policy change in customer generator. Do you have some thoughts about that, those issues?
I was worried you were going to ask me that, Senator. So the department's concerns, this is the first I've heard of them. So I don't want to get out over my skis, as one says, in reaction to them, but we did have the opportunity to review this language, and we are comfortable and supportive of the bill as written.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. Jason Stock, you're in favor but not wishing to speak, or wishing to speak? Come on. All right, good. Anybody else want to speak on this?
Let's have Heidi back.
Yeah, Senator Waters, Heidi, can you at least respond to what the department had, if you both could come up? I just want to hear, and if the department wants to speak again on this as well, we'll give them that opportunity as well. Thoughts, concerns?
Yeah, maybe just in reaction to the suggestion that we could amend the PPA with the mill and that would solve for the issue. In our view, there's really only two ways to address this outside of this statute. One would be that Brookfield, the unaffiliated entity to the mill, take on sort of the customer responsibility at the point of interconnection. So that would be an unaffiliated entity taking on the responsibility of the mill and its costs to the utility. So that's a bit of a strange and a difficult proposition. The other would be to ultimately kind of rewire the situation and become the customer at the point of interconnection. But then you sort of undermine the initial intent of this provision in the first place, which is intended to just allow these stations or hydro stations to participate without sort of new interconnection configurations.
Senator Pearl?
So you were sort of highlighting the two things that I had going around in my head. We're still all in agreement that it seems that all the testimony we've heard, that this is a very narrow situation with only two people or two entities that it's going to impact. And you're still comfortable that there is no way you can think of that somebody could exploit this and come in with a new generation?
Yeah, in our view, and I think the department, in fact, confirmed this, the only way to make additional changes that might benefit new generators or different generators would be a new legislative proposal making new statutory change.
Okay, thank you.
Right, and the other thing to keep in mind is that, there would be interconnection agreements, there are interconnection standards, it's kind of like codes, things evolve over time. And so anything new coming along would have to comply with that, as opposed to these kind of legacy wiring situations. I was going to say, too, that, the department is talking about concerns about the customers and the generators. That's exactly what group net metering or virtual net metering is. There's a generator, and then separate from the generator are one or more customers that are in the group. And we've had group metering on the books for many, many years, and we've had municipal group net metering now on the books since 90, with the passage of House Bill 315 in 2021, which was at that signing ceremony. So.
And one thing just to clarify is that a Brookfield affiliate, GLHA, is an interconnection customer of Eversource. We have an interconnection agreement with the utility. We're just not the retail customer at the point of interconnection.
Further questions? Seeing none. Oh, Senator Waters.
So I don't know if this is, I mean, this is a matter of policy, not grammar. But I'm, sensitive to what Josh Elliott has told us. And I wondered if on line 12, if we inserted individual total peak generating capacity and only such a hydroelectric generator shall be eligible as a customer generator. I mean, I understand what Josh Elliott is telling us, and I'm not really sure this addresses that primary objection, but I think that at least put some belts and suspenders that we're saying this is for this situation. Right. It's not about changing the definition of customer generator as a definition, and we can parse what does it really mean to change the definition or not. And I hear what's being said about it, but it would at least say, if anybody else does come along, that this law is very clearly not setting a precedent. It is saying it is specific to this situation. So would that create a problem for you to put a phrase in there like that?
On first review, I don't see any issue with that in terms of implementing the intent of this.
Yep, and I think that clarification would be fine.
Okay. Josh?
I have to take it back to folks at the department. I don't think it allays our concerns.
I bet it doesn't. I'm trying.
All right.
The only other thing I was going to mention, there was a question by Senator Bergstell about, new generation, and I think we said it in our testimony, but in the case of Brookfield, this excess generation would now be made available under the municipal group net metering program. So any sort of municipal, county, state, government entities or any other political subdivisions would have now access to this, purchasing this power locally. So it would be local power for local consumption.
All right. Thank you very much. No further questions? All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Interesting. Yeah. All right. Anybody else want to talk? Mark Brown, I saw your hand almost going up. No? No? Okay.
Thank you, though.
You're very welcome.
I want to explain that.
Yeah. Any further questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. We're going to close the hearing on SB 40. All right. And the next, I don't have anybody else to speak on that.
Is that this, or you going straight into
What time's the next bill?
20 minutes ago?
No, let's go into the next bill. And you know what? I need a copy of it because it's not in my folder for some reason. This bill.
Here you go.
Oh.
Take mine.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, we will recognize Senator Avard to introduce Senate Bill 54. Senator, you have the floor.
All right, thank you very much, senators and committee members, Mr. Chair. I'm going to basically just introduce this bill. This one's a little more complicated, and it's definitely going to need some work because we have a lot of interested parties wanting to discuss this. So I'm just going to introduce it as for analysis. Basically, this bill requires electric distribution utilities to issue a request for proposal to provide more diverse and long-term options for providing default energy services to customers in purchased power agreements as directed by the Public Utilities Commission. There's going to be a lot of discussion about this bill, and we're looking for new ways to lower our costs. And this is one of the ways that maybe we can have a conversation about. But there's going to be some, I think a lot of conversation about this, and I think the bill is going to definitely need to be tweaked. Hearing discussions outside the committee, so I just assume let the individuals testify on this, so that we can tease out areas where it may need some changes. So with that, I end my testimony and just let some people testify to it.
Thank you. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we'll have, first one on the list is Mark Brown from Consumer Energy Alliance, and he's taken a neutral position. He wishes to speak. Welcome, Mark.
I thought I was loud enough. No, don't do that to me. One of the things we want to raise really quickly is on line 15 of page 2, electric distribution company shall. We may want to change that to may, but that's obviously something for, probably a further discussion outside of this room. But if you're going to have shall remain in there, then you probably want to put some type of percentage of the utilities load, so that there's some, restraints there as well. But in our opinion, this is I guess it's a financial instrument that can be used as a hedge against the volatility that we're currently seeing in default energy service rates. And, we look forward to working with everybody, the committee and other stakeholders, and happy to answer any questions.
Mark, thank you for your testimony. Do you have any suggestions as facility load or percentage if we keep?
Oh, gosh, no, I think that would have to come from the utilities. I think, they would probably know what percentage of their load I think it would have to come from them, but they would know what percentage of the load would probably function as a hedge to try to limit some of that volatility. I couldn't speak to that.
And we could solve that by saying may?
Exactly. And I think that allows them flexibility, right? So maybe 1 year it's 20%, because they get really good contracts and it looks good. The next year it may only be 5% because, for whatever reason, it's not as beneficial to consumers, to do that. So I would, mandates generally don't work out well, so.
Senator Waters with a question.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, if I may. So, Mark, that shall is existing language.
Yeah.
So has there been any problems with that?
Well, I think my question is, does this refers to the RPS, right? But if this is going to refer to procurements, then are we requiring that? Like, what if we want to purchase more or less?
Well,
I think.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, it's existing language, so we've been doing this
Right.
since we've had the RPS. So I'm not sure why the changes in this bill would necessitate going to May, right, when we've been doing shall for, I mean, I don't know how many years that's been in, but it's been a long time.
The shall is part of, default service requirements for the utilities. I just think by having this be may, it allows for more flexibility for, again, it could be, what if a utility could enter into a really good long-term contract with hydro and nuclear? So this would require them to add, essentially RPS requirements to it. So if the goal is to reduce volatility and to somehow benefit consumers, then I think it's too limiting. Or you could add a renewable energy component to it and say that, X percentage of the procurement has to be from renewable energy. I just think we want to be flexible, that's all.
If I may, but if you look at the language there on line 18, it says to meet a portion of the default service requirements. I mean, this is the structure we've had for the RPS, and if you go to May, it says that they don't have, maybe they don't do anything, you know what I'm saying? So that the shall is in the context of meeting that, and if they want to do something beyond what, our RPS amounts now are just kind of, below the baseline on the graphs now, but you see what I'm saying, is if they want to do something more or otherwise, I don't see why this is relevant to that.
I just think it's good to be more flexible and allow for different resources to be. Again, we've seen what's happened. Vermont is a very good example. They have power purchase agreements with Hydro-Quebec for, I think it's 100, 150 megawatts. Some years, those are really good contracts. They provide great benefits to consumers. Some years, they're more expensive than, the market might be. They provide a hedge. I think as the way this bill is written, we couldn't say enter into a contract, utilities couldn't enter into a contract for a similar type of, arrangement with, Moore, Comerford, or whatever, which are, New Hampshire hydro facilities. So I just think, in my opinion, it's good to be flexible, but that's for you guys to decide.
Yeah, I guess I think the flexibility is already in there. Default service requirements, more than one contract, vary in terms of lengths.
Maybe I'm misreading it.
Flexible
it's possible.
As you can get already. So
I'm sure people behind me can tell me if I am or not.
Thank you for your testimony. Any further questions? Seeing none, I'm going to jump ahead and ask the Office of Consumer Advocate to come in, Don Crease, who's also neutral. And I love hearing your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, honorable members of the committee. Since this is my first chance to appear before this particular iteration of this committee, I'm just going to take a minute to introduce myself. My name is Donald Crease. I'm the consumer advocate, and by statute, I and my little state agency represent the interests of residential utility customers in front of the PUC and basically anywhere else on the planet where those interests are at issue, including here. I have a small staff of 5 people, and currently 2 of those jobs are vacant. I'm approaching the 7th anniversary of my service as consumer advocate, and I am seeking a new term when my current one expires later this year. And just to be clear, we are independent. I do not report to the Commissioner of Energy. I do not report to the Chairman of the Public Utilities Commission. As Chairman Avard indicated, I am neutral on Senate Bill 54. At the same time, I thank the sponsors for introducing this bill and thereby getting the General Court to be proactive in addressing a real crisis that we are currently confronting. As you probably have figured out by now, default energy service is in turmoil. The prices charged by our 3 investor-owned utilities, Eversource, Liberty, and Unitil, have more than doubled in scarcely a year. Yes, you can get off default service by choosing a competitive supplier, and yes, you can persuade your municipality to participate in community power aggregation, but there will always be at least some customers, especially residential customers, who will take default service. We can't forget those people. We know that something is wrong because while Eversource, Liberty, and Unitil have followed the PUC's marching orders and ended up with a default energy service price of 20 cents or more, the New Hampshire Electric Cooperative, which is not overseen in terms of rates by the PUC, is somehow able to offer the exact same service for only 13 cents. And next door in Maine, the two investor-owned utilities are selling their default service, they call it standard offer, for 16 or 17 cents. While the PUC has an open investigation on this subject, the answer really turns on policy choices more than anything else. And so the subject, I think, is really ripe for legislative action. It looks to me like Senate Bill 54 proceeds from the laudable premise that a good crisis should never be squandered. The idea, as I understand it, is to authorize utilities to build their default energy service portfolio around power purchase agreements with renewable energy producers. My advice is proceed, but do so with caution. To some degree, Senate Bill 54 could be understood as yet another bid to walk back restructuring and rebuild the vertically integrated utility empires of the good old days. Questions about that loom, one of which is, what happens when almost nobody is taking default service, but these purchase power agreements remain in place? In my opinion, the public interest would be well served if we put all the smart people in a room to figure out what approach is the best approach. I probably don't qualify as one of those smart people, but I would like to be invited anyway to make sure that the interests of residential ratepayers are protected, because as I like to say, ultimately, we are the only wallet in the room. That's all I have to say, but I'd be, of course, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for your testimony. Questions from the committee, Senator Waters.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. So on your last point, Don, and good to see you too in a new iteration. Here we are. I understand that concern. I mean, if you're the last customer, you own the utility, right? So, but on the other hand, do you think that that larger issue? Do you think that we need to address that in the context before we do this bill?
Yes. The short answer to that question is yes. Mm-hmm. This bill has a specific focus. Let's encourage the development of renewable energy by building it into the default service portfolio. And my friend Mr. Brown had an interesting idea talking about firm energy. Mm-hmm. That is one potential approach to making sure if we commit ratepayer dollars to renewable energy, that the renewable energy really performs. But really the whole meta question needs a thorough examination, and you folks are just the people to do it. Yeah.
But
I know that because the men are all wearing those long ties.
I'm sorry, do we have to do it right now?
Do you have to do it right now? I think, well, you don't have to do it.
Before we pass this?
Yes. I think you would be well advised to do that now, not necessarily in the next 5 minutes or the next day, but in this term, because we are in a real crisis.
Okay.
Pondering. Senator Waters with Senator Bertzel with a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm not sure you're the right person to ask, but I'm sure you'll tell me someone else is coming up that can answer.
Or I'll make up an answer.
But the question I have is, I know in this legislation, they were lining out the Department of Energy and adding the Public Utilities Commission in there. And my concern is we already have the PUC has already increased customer rates to the point where it's unfathomable. Why would we give them more authority?
That's an interesting question. The Public Utilities Commission takes a lot of hits for approving rates that it has no choice but to approve. I'm talking about the default service proceedings. But when the General Court created the Department of Energy a year and a half ago, I think that it really envisioned the Department of Energy as the place where a lot of the policy conversations would happen, and the PUC would be just adjudicating things and not making policy choices. So it's a very legitimate and timely question about whether whether the PUC is really the right decider here. Again, that's why I think it's useful to take a step back and look at the big question of how we want to solve the default service puzzle. And in Maine, for example, the Public Utilities Commission actually does the default energy service procurement. So you could go in that direction, whole hog into having the government get up to its neck in this.
Thank you.
Further questions? Senator Waters?
And so, Don, if you could look to page 2, where we have H there. In terms of this conversation about firm and so I guess, would it make sense to say that if we have a concern about firm, rather than us trying to hit the dartboard with a percentage, that would it make more sense to say that consideration of firm be something that the PUC should do in these resources?
Yes, I think when Mr. Brown told you that that was really a question to address to the utilities, he made a good point. Default service is a moving target.
Right.
And so in any different year or any different procurement, the percentage of power you might want to lock up via this mechanism might indeed vary. So that is a good candidate for consigning to the discretion of some administrative decider, and probably it is the PUC.
So if I may follow up, so if you look at H, what if we put there any other factors necessary to determine whether the proposal is just and reasonable in the public interest, including a reasonable percentage that can be considered a firm supply for default services?
Well, if I were charged with interpreting that language, I would see that as a legislative nudge to include some percentage of firm capacity in the default service portfolio.
Okay. Thank you.
Further questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. We appreciate you.
My pleasure. Look forward to coming back again.
All right, and we'd like to hear from the department now. Josh Elliott, who is also neutral. I'm calling all the neutral people first.
Jumping from the definition of customer generator to PPAs is probably the only transition that's going to be this is the only transition that's going to look easier, and the only time it's going to look easier. So, the department is neutral on this bill. As highlighted earlier with Senator Birdsell's question, in section 2, the department doesn't have any concerns. Given the impact on rates, it makes sense that the Public Utilities Commission has this duty and has this purview, given that it will eventually get folded into default service rates. There's an existing process with stakeholders and interveners and et cetera. So it does make sense. From the department's standpoint, it does make sense for this duty to be conducted by the Public Utilities Commission rather than the department itself. I will say we do on section 3, which is really the heart of the bill here, we do have some concerns with taking this approach. And again, we are neutral but with concerns. So you've heard a lot. Supply, the concern is around supply and price, and this doesn't necessarily improve supply or bring down the price. There's no limits on the size or duration of these contracts. As mentioned earlier in earlier testimony, there's no firm requirements to provide power or requirements for financial backing of these potential bidders. There's no cap on market prices. And I do just want to highlight, as well as this not technology neutral, right? We're procuring from specific technologies. In classes 1 through 4, rather than just either renewable or just carbon neutral or however, or zero carbon, however you wish to define it. I do want to highlight that there is a potential impact on default service rates as well, outside of just whatever the costs are from this. Since default service will be becoming increasingly reliant on producing power, default service will be becoming increasingly relied upon for producing, for making supply available during peak times, usually around twilight, as renewable sources are sort of falling off. I think we've all seen the curves, and that will end up increasing risk for those folks who are responsible for producing that electricity during those times, potentially, and then with the increase in risk comes the increase in price. I do wish to want to highlight sort of at a fundamental level, purchase power agreements do end up shifting risk from the private developers of these generation assets onto the ratepayers, right? They get a firm contract no matter what's going on. And I do, not to say that there aren't any good PPAs or that there aren't any ones that sort of work in the balance of the ratepayers at certain times, but I just want to issue a word of caution with these types of arrangements. And I'm going to talk about three in particular, just from recent memory in New England. First is, of course, the Berlin Burgess Biomass Power Plant. We've been in, I know folks on this committee or have been in this room multiple times trying to figure out exactly how we tackle that to make sure that it still remains running and open, providing the jobs for the forest industry, et cetera, for the North Country, while also making sure that costs to the ratepayers are minimized. I believe the most recent number is somewhere north of somewhere probably it's a little bit less now given where energy default service rates are, but the ratepayers have paid somewhere upwards of $150 million in out-of-market costs for that plant. This is a little bit more specific, but when you're talking about procurement of classes 1, 2, 3, and 4 renewable energy certificates or RECs. And I apologize. I know there's some members who are new to this committee. If I'm throwing around too many acronyms, just raise your hand, stop me, and I'll come back to it. But essentially, renewable energy certificates are the renewable attributes of power from electricity generation. So the best way I've heard it described is like this. If you have a cup of water in a pool, you dump your cup of water into the pool and say, okay, I want my cup of water back, right? You can't figure out where your water went. It's in there, it's part of the larger pool, but these renewable, same thing works with electrons, right? With whenever electricity is produced, it goes to wherever the closest demand is for that electricity generation, for that electricity. So these renewable energy certificates are essentially the renewable attributes of that electricity. So you're able to, even though the electricity is generated closest to the source, you can basically get the credit, if you will, for lack of a better way of talking about it, for those renewable sources. So there is an active market trading in renewable energy certificates that are bought and sold by the generators and then purchased by the electric suppliers, whether it's the utilities providing default service or any of the competitive suppliers in order to meet their requirements under the Renewable Portfolio Standard. And as an open market, though they trade and sell based on supply and demand. So in particular, I want to talk about Class 3 RECs, which is for biomass. Massachusetts has recently decided, and it's a policy decision, that they are no longer going to accept Class 3 RECs for biomass in terms of their compliance with their renewable portfolio standards. Connecticut has decided that they are only going to allow biomass to be used for, I believe it's half of their, and I can't recall which class it is, because of course it's New England and none of the classes all line up with each other, but there's a great diagram in our annual report that explains what class belongs to what in what state that Karen Crampton made, so I can't even claim credit for it. But as you can imagine, the market price for those Class 3 RECs are going to drop dramatically. If you consider Massachusetts is no longer saying, we aren't going to accept these as a matter of policy, and Connecticut is saying, okay, well, you can only use half of them. You can only use those types of RECs for only half of your requirements for this specific class. There's going to be extra Class 3 RECs on the market. Now, if you're in a PPA, for those Class 3 RECs, ratepayers may be on the hook for an extended period of time, paying whatever the market rate was, or maybe above or below those market rates for an extended period of time, even though the open market for those RECs would be dramatically lower. And I know this is a very long-winded way of saying this, but those REC prices are not just set by New Hampshire policymakers. They are set and impacted by policy decisions made by other states that are out of the jurisdiction of New Hampshire. So I want to highlight that that's a concern of where you could see markets reacting in such a way and decisions made outside of New Hampshire that would directly impact the market price for those RECs. The last one, and this one's been more recently in the news, the offshore wind procurement in Massachusetts, bless you, where one of the developers, the ink was, I think, barely dried. I don't even know if you wanted the pen barely left the paper before the developer wanted to renegotiate the PPA for that particular offshore wind development. There was an adjudicated process. They tried to stop or in order to sort of renegotiate, the Mass DPU said, nope, it's going forward. And I'm very, very much doing a summary of this. But essentially, it sort of raises the concern that, even if there are these PPAs are out there, if there's a chance, or if it's greatly in the ratepayers' interest, or it might be a great benefit to the ratepayers at some point, that there's always the chance the developers come back and say, oh, well, we want to renegotiate. Prices have gone up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea of a PPA is you're supposed to have that stability, and it's not just, okay, the developer gets to make money, the ratepayers get to save money too. But it's much easier for the developer just to say, well, we're going out of business. And, we're declaring bankruptcy and all the agreements are null and void, versus the state, the ratepayers, as the consumer advocate put it so succinctly, the ratepayers are the ones with the wallets here. So, one additional thing, I know there is an FN that is pending from the Public Utilities Commission, and at the request of the Public Utilities Commission, as well as the department, I would like to highlight that both agencies would need additional staff. Purchase power agreements are not just sort of a minor addition to regular default service procurements or to rate cases. That there's a significant amount of time and effort that has to go into evaluating these sorts of agreements that both the Public Utilities Commission and the department do not currently have. So whether that is through additional staff or additional contracted support in order to evaluate these agreements, that when the fiscal notice is completed, that will be reflected there. So with that, I know I have said a lot. I'm going to stop talking and let's someone ask a question.
Senator Waters.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Josh. It's interesting in that there's an awful lot of issues that you mentioned that we really are going to increasingly have to deal with, I had just want to note a couple of things. In the bill that we passed last year to give the department authority to set the criteria for PPAs for offshore wind, and in the original bill and then in the newer one, it said that there's going to need to be staff, and it's going to have to be paid for by the developers, and so I think that that's a good point that we have in statute, and as the FN comes forward, I think it's something that we recognize and have recognized in the previous bills that this is something that even if they're not that they're not mandated purchase power agreements, but if there are purchase power agreements, we got to make sure that the staff is there and it's covered so that the ratepayers are protected on that. Now, I am getting to a question, but I just wanted to mention too that you mentioned being long-winded, and nobody's more long-winded than me. Okay, so please. But I speak of long-winded.
Put that into the permit journal.
Yes, but put it in the permit journal because what's more long-winded than offshore wind? And I just wanted to say a couple of things that when the sun goes down, solar goes down, but in the Gulf of Maine, winds are higher at night, and it does come back then to the firm issue on how it is that with storage and with those variable resources that we end up with reliable supply. And to that point, I don't know if you'll be there, but on Wednesday night, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is having its hearing for New Hampshire on as of last Wednesday, Tuesday, the newly released maps, revised maps for the call areas out there, and the initial 3.6 gigawatts. And the Federal Department of Energy are announcing sometime this week expedited regulations and permitting requirements so that we might see steel in the water sooner than we think. So we're going to be ready for it. And then also this notion of the renegotiation of Mayflower Wind. I mean, the market, it's a new market. So what's right pricing and the cost of steel and so on. So I think these are all important things. And what I'm circling back to the bill here is that I think all the issues you raise are ones that to be dealt with. But the bottom line of the bill, isn't it, that we want to provide this flexibility in terms of contract lengths so that maybe we can layer contracts and not end up in the fix that we got into. So, but in that regard, you heard me recommend on page 2 in H that we add some firm language there. And does that seem to to be helpful to you, that we would, be able to think in those terms as far as these or not?
I think it does. Again, I would want to check with the folks in our regulatory side. Tom Franz, who I know you, some of you know quite well, to make sure that that does what the intention is and that how it would be read. But yes, to your point of having those firm language in there that there's a firm supply. As you mentioned, between storage and offshore wind, there's a lot that's going on in this sort of sector to take sort of the intermittent out of intermittent resources. But sorry, at the risk of being long-winded, I will check with.
No, we'll just see. I just don't
yes,
know. I
yeah, I
just
think
toss it out there, and this is just how we're gonna. I think we want to pass something like this bill. I really do think we need to, but we don't want to do it in such a way that doesn't account for things we can take account of.
Exactly right. Markets are going to do what the markets are going to do. But yeah, it's I think the sort of the underlying point of my testimony is to make sure that the ratepayer's wallet isn't left on the hook for these for any excessive out of market costs.
Thank you.
Further questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator.
I'll probably call you back if I need you.
Always happy to be at service.
Yes, and we appreciate that. Kirsten Koch from BIA. Welcome. She is also neutral, wishing to speak.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Kirsten Koch, and I represent the Business and Industry Association, also known as BIA, and we serve as New Hampshire's statewide Chamber of Commerce. I come before you today to register BIA's neutral position on Senate Bill 54. We believe that New Hampshire must utilize every tool in its tool belt to resolve the energy crisis the state is currently dealing with. We believe that the concept of energy procurement is potentially an innovative way to lower energy costs for the Granite State, and we're certainly interested and open to working with the committee and other stakeholders to advance this proposal as a way to increase energy production in a manner that could also lower costs for ratepayers. We see two key criteria that must be addressed in order for this legislation to successfully advance. First, we believe that the energy procurement process should be technology neutral. And second, we believe that the procurement process should have adequate safeguards and mechanisms to ensure that costs will be lowered for New Hampshire ratepayers. We believe by taking a technology neutral, all of the above approach to energy procurement, that technology-driven projects that are most effective at reducing costs and delivering benefits to ratepayers will help resolve the current energy crisis. Our concern is that, as introduced, Senate Bill 54 uses REC classes to guide what projects are eligible for procurement, and this is potentially limiting access to specific technologies. The development of new local energy sources will no doubt deliver a multitude of benefits. This includes economic development benefits, local tax revenue, and environmental benefits. However, in our view, reducing costs for ratepayers should be the primary benefit and outcome achieved through this process. And we support safeguards in this legislation to ensure this result. Given how recently this bill was published, we don't have specific language prepared, but we're more than happy to work with the committee and any stakeholders on developing that. So thank you for your consideration. This concludes my testimony. I'm happy to try to answer any questions.
Questions from the committee? So if you folks can come up with some ideas, I think we're going to have a lot of stakeholders. We probably should have some kind of a way for everybody to get together to help us with this, because we want to lower the cost of energy. We want this to be for everybody. It's a good idea, good conversation piece, but we would love for you folks to come up with some ideas.
Thank you, Senator. We'd be happy to help.
Yeah, thank you. No further questions.
Thanks.
So I'm going to try to read this name. I think it's Meredith. Wow, did I do that right? Yes. Fantastic. Yes, beautiful. Welcome. And Meredith, you are also neutral.
So my name is Meredith Hatfield. I'm Associate Director for Policy and Government Relations and I'll make that clear why, but I think it captures our thinking right now, because generally we're supportive of moving this direction, but we did have a few concerns otherwise. So just about the Nature Conservancy, we work in New Hampshire and around the world to conserve lands and waters, guided by science.
Is your mic on? Thank you.
Sorry about that. Over 60 years in New Hampshire, TNC has helped protect nearly 300 acres of forest fields and natural areas, as well as more than 680 miles of coastal shoreline and river frontage. And we also have a long history of collaborative efforts on policy issues, including energy policy. With unprecedented energy prices and the urgent need to diversify our energy sources further, we thank the sponsors for this bill, and we think it's very timely, and we'd be happy to be at the table as you explore options. As the consumer advocate noted, we also wanted to mention that there is an investigation underway at the Public Utilities Commission, and in looking at that docket online, the utilities have provided a good amount of information that I think could really be helpful to the conversation, so definitely would recommend hearing from them. As Senator Waters mentioned, under the law today, utilities may take a PPA, a proposed PPA, to the PUC, and the PUC may approve them. There are a few that are already in place. Over the years, the PUC has considered them, and Mr. Elliott referred to the Berlin Biomass PPA, and there's also a PPA with the Lemster Wind Farm that was approved by the PUC. The changes in Section 1 that changes the review back to the PUC, my understanding is that when the DOE was created last year, this duty was moved from the PUC to the DOE. We do think it makes sense to put it back with the PUC. As others have mentioned, it's important to have an adjudicative proceeding where the parties can file testimony and evidence and then have a decision that folks can appeal if needed. So we do support that change. We do think it's important that, and one of the concerns we have is the types of power that would be eligible. As an environmental organization, we are focused on the urgent need to act on climate, and we support the idea of allowing clean energy PPAs that are paid for by ratepayers, but we would urge caution in what's been discussed as the all of the above or technology neutral approach. And I would mention that if you go in that direction, this law is not the right place to make the changes that you're looking to make, because this is the RPS. So if you want to go in that direction, I would suggest looking at 374F, which is the overarching electric restructuring law. I think that the utilities, as I think the consumer advocate mentioned, have a lot of flexibility already in how they procure default service. And if you look at that statute, you all have certainly given policy guidance to the utilities in the PUC, but it is quite broad. But I would suggest looking there and not making the RPS technology neutral, so that when we do use ratepayer funds to try to promote clean energy, we stick to clean energy. Some who don't approve of this approach might say that it's not consistent with a market-based approach, and I wanted to say that we disagree. We think that seeking competitive proposals that would be carefully scrutinized by the PUC is actually an appropriate way to use the market as a way to bring lower cost clean energy to ratepayers. As others have said, we do think having a time limit around that third section of the bill, which does change the may to shall, as Senator Waters pointed out, perhaps a time limit or a size limit could be useful, and perhaps in discussions the parties could come up with what makes sense. And in terms of the technology neutral suggestion, we think it's important to point out that those technologies fully participate in the markets today, and that the RPS was specifically created to support cleaner technologies that are more local to New Hampshire. In terms of needing more staff, as someone who has participated in PPA dockets in the past. It's my belief that the staffing is sufficient at this time, and that the tools that the agencies have to access consultants would actually be the appropriate way to ensure that they have the tools they need in order to fully review any proposed PPAs. And I'm happy to try to answer any questions.
Thank you for your testimony. Questions from the committee? Senator Waters.
Thank you, and I'm sorry I wasn't here for the first part of your testimony. Just a couple of questions. In perspective environmentally and renewable energy, the technology neutral when it comes to public health effects and the transition to renewable energy, isn't really the appropriate language, is it? Because the neutrality implies that the costs of the technologies that are creating the health problems and other issues about the environment are not factored in to certain technologies.
That's correct. We have developed some mechanisms to try to put pricing in, such as RGGI and things like that, but generally all of those costs are externalities.
If I may follow it up, and would it be fair to say that in terms of where we are with the cost of the levelized cost of energy for renewable power sources, if not now already cheaper than fossil fuel sources, certainly the learning on things like hydrogen and offshore wind, et cetera, is such that the prices are in fact extremely competitive, and have created the issue now where we have FERC and NUPL kind of subsidizing and supporting supplies of fossil fuel generated energy because they couldn't survive in a marketplace that brings in those new resources. Isn't that more or less the picture we're looking at?
That is actually why we support changing the language from may to shall to require the utilities to propose PPAs with clean energy, because it is so cost competitive right now.
Thank you.
Further questions? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mike Licata, Eversource. Also neutral.
Good morning. Again, Michael Licata with Eversource Energy, testifying on this piece of legislation that, as the chair said, we are neutral on at this time. Just want to start off and say we really appreciate both the bill sponsors' intent with this legislation and a willingness to look at sort of creative approaches to address the supply issues that we're seeing in New Hampshire, in New England, that have driven energy service prices so high. We do have a number of concerns with the bill as currently drafted, and we would very much like the opportunity to participate in future discussions to address those concerns. And the one that I'd like to highlight, the consumer advocate actually picked up on, which is the issue of cost recovery and these long-term PPAs being a part of the energy service rate or default service. Our expectation is that in the coming years, the number of customers who elect to take default service will decrease significantly. Right now, 87% of residential customers are taking default or energy service from Eversource. With the passage of opt-out community power municipal aggregation programs, our expectation is that number will drop significantly. And so if the intent is that these PPAs are a part of the default service portfolio, it puts the utilities in a very difficult and awkward position where we're not sure how much to procure, how many customers. Yes, sir.
Just finish that sentence and then I want to.
How many customers will remain on default service over the length of those contracts?
What is a typical PPA? What is the typical length?
So 20 years is often a number that gets thrown around to incent the development of a new facility. So think of a solar or wind a facility that usually is the kind of long-term certainty that a developer is looking for to make the finances of their project work. But I know there are others representing the developer community who could speak probably better to that than I can.
Okay, all right. Continue, and I
Yep.
appreciate that.
No problem. So as you have customers electing to take either competitive supply or electing to be a part of a municipal community power aggregation, you have a shrinking number of customers on default service, which again creates financial difficulty in terms of the utility's ability to recover the costs associated with this. We think that there are ways to address that. Other states who have looked to long-term contracts to incent the development or retention of generation sources in and around their states have different mechanisms that spread the cost or the benefit of those projects to all customers. So we would very much like to have that discussion. To answer Senator Waters' question of Attorney Crease, we do think that it is critical to address that as part of this legislation in order to get that correct before we're able to move forward. With that, I know a lot of folks had opined on other parts of this, and again, I don't want to be repetitive, but we very much appreciate the intent of the bill and would like to be a part of constructive conversations to address our concerns.
Do you have suggestions for language at this point?
This one kind of snuck up on us in terms of scheduling, so we do have sort of conceptual language based upon our experience in other jurisdictions that we don't have today, but we could certainly provide in the near future.
Okay. This is an FN, so these are one of those that we have to push forward.
Absolutely.
So if everybody who is interested in this bill wants to send us some language, some ideas, and then maybe we can share that in like a group, whatever, just so that everybody's on the same page. But we'd like to hear everybody's input with different. I knew right from the beginning that we're going to have this kind of a conversation. So we want to come up with a solution with everybody as interested in focus. So with that, are there any other questions from the committee? Thank you very much. We appreciate that. Appreciate your testimony. And now we're going to go to the againsts. William Fortune, in opposition, wishing to speak. William? Who? William? I got a little bit. I know it's dry in here. You have the floor, sir.
Yes, sir. You're going to get a copy of 6 different papers regarding energy. I'm Bill Fortune. I represent the people of New Hampshire, the ratepayers of New Hampshire. I have no connection with any business or politics or anything else. So, my testimony today relates to all the legislation that was before the committee today and will be before the committee in the future. The bio is necessary, as I am told that Mike Vose, the chairman of the New Hampshire House Science and Technology Committee, is considered New Hampshire's energy expert.
Okay.
I assume that Mr. Avard is also considered an energy expert.
Not so.
Vose, and this is by the, these people are considered energy experts by the Republicans legislators. I want to note that Vose is a writer of history books and a hiker. He says I don't know what I'm talking about. I note that AVAD has refused in the past to enter into discussions. I note that there's a lawyer behind me who's supposed to be a consumer advocate, and I say he's no consumer advocate. The primary reason,
I'm not gonna let you just tear
have-
people down. Please don't tear people down in my committee. You have a you can speak to whatever.
Okay.
And you can chew me out.
when
But I'm
people
gonna ask-
when people attack me, then I'm just gonna say that,
But
you know,
this isn't
I
the
don't
place-
accept their attack.
This is not the place to attack people.
Okay.
And I will not allow it.
The primary reason the cost of electricity is so high is because of the politicians. From Edison beginning in New York, politicians have increased taxes, required dozens of programs for special interest groups, and controls on utility companies. The more programs for special interest groups and the more control, the higher the cost. It's like a spouse or a partner trying to get their needs met by controlling the other partner. It's sick. It's just plain sick. Trying to control people to get what you're trying to, get your own needs met. It's like domestic abuse. Being in control, trying to control people is harmful to industry. The generation and distribution of electricity has been made so complicated by gaslighting, politicians, and control freaks that Meredith Angwin spent 4 years studying the grid, which resulted in a 400-page book called Shorting the Grid. There's no need for any of this complication. There's no need to be giving dozens, at least 2 dozen, programs for special interest groups. I want to note that generally it only costs 2.5 cents to generate electricity in New England, except for the present situation. That means that people are paying about a 385% taxation on electricity. It's not the utility company's fault. There is a single solution. There is a simple solution to reducing the present cost of electricity by about 75%. The other 5 papers that you have will describe how, starting with a recent email exchange between a legislator and myself. It kind of lays out what can be done, and it answers some of the questions that people on other committees have. Also included in the other 5 comments describing how and why renewable energy, also including in the other 5 comments describing how renewable energy is a costly scam. The papers in order are emails with New Hampshire rep, which I referenced, how politicians and lawyers are the real con artists, and calculations. I want to point out, nobody, I've been on this for 5 years, 6 years now, nobody in the United States, New Hampshire, has provided calculations to show how many solar panels, how many windmills, how many batteries, and the cost to provide New Hampshire with the power it uses. Specifically, calculations showing how much renewable energy we need to provide the electricity that New Hampshire uses between 3:30 and 9:30 p.m., which is about 10 to 11,000 megawatts. Nobody's provided any calculations to show how they're going to provide that 11,000 megawatts, but between that time frame, with a peak of 2,600 megawatts between 8:30 and 9:30 p.m. You should also note that when the people are allowed to put power on the grid, the solar power on the grid, it's essentially worthless. We don't need it. It's not needed. Because the demand isn't there for it. The demand is after the sun goes down. So this net metering thing is a real problem. And the problem is that the general public doesn't understand net metering and how it's costing them a lot of money. The last paper calls for a federal lawsuit to recover the many millions of billions of dollars as a result of one special interest group program called net metering. I say it's unconstitutional to force people to pay, well, big money so somebody else can get a discount because they use solar panels. You probably don't know how that works. I see the expression on your face. The issue is that people who put solar power on the grid get a credit, not in money, but in kilowatts. They get that credit. So they put the power on the grid during the day when it's worthless essentially. It's worth 2 cents or less, sometimes 0. That means that the power company, the generators have to either shut down or turn down, and they lose money. So ISO New England has to pay them. Then, when the solar panels don't produce anymore, then those people who put power on the grid get a credit for the power they use. So they don't pay anything for that power. So that means that someone else has got to pay for it, because the generators have to make up for the money they lost. And it disrupts the whole system. Okay, all these solar panels are disrupting the whole system. The bottom line is, it is absolutely not necessary to have any renewable energy. We have more clean, safe, abundant, inexpensive, waste-consuming energy than we can use. All we have to do is get the politicians, the bureaucrats, and the lawyers out of the way, and we could get these power plants built. The law in New Hampshire allows us to do that. It's called New Hampshire Electric Co-op uses that law. We can generate our own electricity. So all this stuff is in these papers, and I hope you will try to comprehend it. If you refuse, you don't want to, then I ask that you recuse yourself from making any decisions on electricity and just get out of the way. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you very much. For the record, I feel my highly esteemed lawyer back there, Mr. Don Kreis, is very capable, and I apologize. This committee is not going to tolerate anybody denigrating anybody, ever, on whatever issue there is. We respect everybody in the room. You can chew me out all you want. That's fine. But everybody else in this room is safe. And if that happens again, I'll kick you out. Whoever's tearing anybody down. And for the record, I'm not a politician, nor is anybody up here. We're servants. We don't get paid like politicians. We donate our time. So with that, thank you very much. And next, Molly. You have the floor, Molly.
Can't wait, sir.
Oh.
So for some of you, I'm new, I know, and for some, I'm a familiar face. My name is Molly Connors. I'm with the New England Power Generators Association. Before I launch into the specifics of the bill that I want to address, I want to make sure that NEPCA is a familiar organization to everyone here, sort of level set. Our members are the non-utility owned merchant power generators in the region. My members represent 90% of the installed capacity throughout the 6 New England states. Throughout the states, they employ more than 4,000 people and provide more than 25,000 megawatts of generating capacity. And I think it's important to note that our members own and operate just about every type of generating facility there is, including not only natural gas and oil, but they own the majority of the region's solar and wind power plants, as well as nearly all of the hydro assets in the region. Specifically in New Hampshire, we employ more than 750 people. We pay tens of millions in property taxes. We provide approximately 2,700 megawatts of generating capacity. Of those 2,700, about 1,300 megawatts are carbon-free, and about 178 megawatts are renewables. As an organization, we do not advocate for one type of resource over another. Our mission is to support the competitive electricity markets in the region, and we believe that open markets guided by stable public policy are the best means to provide reliable and competitively priced electricity for consumers. A sensible market-based approach furthers economic development, jobs, and economic policy, and advances in economic policies for the region. So specific to this bill, we oppose it as introduced. Obviously, we know that this is early in the process and that there's a lot of very important issues that people feel the need to address. So we recognize that. It's really the wording that we have in front of us that we just want to raise concerns about. And I want to note that the reason that we oppose this bill is sort of the aggressive approach regarding long-term contracts for energy from any particular resource. We oppose those because they have detrimental impacts, although unintended detrimental impacts. They have detrimental impacts to the wholesale electricity markets, and those are the markets that we rely on for reliability purposes in the region. But that being said, I also just want to highlight, we recognize, I can't emphasize this enough, we recognize the pressure that many ratepayers are facing. We recognize that there is a genuine and legitimate need to address how utilities and how competitive suppliers are interacting on behalf of the markets or in the markets on behalf of ratepayers. We represent the power plants that are in the competitive markets, but we recognize that there are ways that people need to be addressing the way that customers are exposed to the impacts of the markets. So I want to highlight why we think markets are good and why it's important to make sure that we protect those as we pursue other necessary and worthy policy goals. The New England regional wholesale electricity markets have been around for more than 20 years. And for those 20 years, those markets have reliably driven costs down to provide the reliability needs for the region. And they do that by running auctions and having power plants compete against one another. Since 2014, and this is a trend line, and I can always follow up with more information for you, but since 2014, wholesale energy prices in New England have declined by 66%, while also driving carbon reductions by 50%. And this is a trend over time that was driven by competition among power plants finding efficiencies so that they would get to run and make money while someone else wouldn't be running.
Can I interrupt you real
Sure.
quick? So I think the big elephant in the room is
Volatility?
No, my electric bill.
Mm-hmm. Right. No, and I should have cautioned, I should have been more blunt up front that that is an overall trend, that the cost of actually generating a megawatt of electricity has gone down. The actual cost of running a power plant of any sort has gone down, and that's because of competition. What we are facing right now as consumers, me, you, everyone that you represent, is a challenge related to disruptions in those markets. So you have the volatility in the markets that we're facing, which is largely related to the types of resources that are in the market and also international things that are out of our control. To put a blunt point on it, the invasion of Russia of the Ukraine had huge impacts on things like natural gas and oil and other commodities. And at a different time, I'm happy to follow up with some information. We did an explainer on this, on why the markets are behaving the way they are right now. And that's partly what we're seeing. And so we recognize the pain point right now for many consumers, and we take it seriously.
And the volatility part?
Is related to supply and demand. And if your supply is facing sort of pressures in terms of how they're going to access the things that they need to generate electricity, you're gonna see higher prices. But that's not just limited to electricity right now. Everything is more expensive. We see that from inflation to fill up the gas in your car, if you want to buy food. I mean, everything that you buy right now is more expensive, and electricity is a part of that larger trend.
Which poses another question. So we have the Russia thing going on. What
Mhm.
happens if there's a Taiwan thing going on, and a couple other things? Shouldn't we be prepared to have a plan B?
That's a really big question, and I'm not an expert on international relations. I think that the reliability of things that are important to you, including electricity, are always things that you should think about in terms of how you want to plan from a public policy point of view. What I can, and so I'm here, I'm happy to have that conversation more. I mean, I'm also trying to be sensitive to the committee's time. I wanted to focus on markets and PPAs in particular, but I'm happy to, and that's what I prepared for, but I'm happy to continue the conversation regarding other issues that I know are sort of being lobbed at you all the time. So I don't want to get out ahead of the committee.
I interrupted you, I apologize.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right, well, I'm happy to answer questions, but I also know it's been a long morning unexpectedly for a lot of people. I want to highlight the issues regarding power purchase agreements, the long-term ones. The issue with them is that they artificially suppress prices in the wholesale electricity markets. The resources that you give a long-term contract to for understandable policy reasons are then also turning around and competing in the electricity market against resources that don't have that outside source of funding. Because the resources that have the contract, they can bid lower than the resources that don't have a contract. As a result, the prices get warped. The markets, the ISO that the region with stakeholders designed are meant to provide a reliability need at the lowest cost. So the cost that you see at any given time is meant to be transparent. It's meant to give you a full sense of the cost of reliability at any given time. If you have no issues on your electric grid, your prices should theoretically be lower. If there's a reliability challenge that you're seeing, then the markets reflect that the circumstances need a little bit more attention to reliability. When you have resources that don't bid in their true costs, it warps the market and it tends to run the prices lower. I can't emphasize that low costs in and of themselves are not a problem. People like to get their costs down. The problem is when you have wholesale markets that are designed to drive our costs low and also provide a reliability need. So what we see as more and more states are introducing long-term contracts is that they have a greater impact on the markets. And so the resources that we rely on for reliability are also the resources that do not have these outside contracts. The result is the prices, the amount of money in the markets is lower. And what we're seeing is that resources are that you need for reliability, that I need for reliability, that are dispatched at the lowest cost, over time are not going to be able to recover their costs. They might not be able to, they might say, we need to make a capital improvement. Capital improvements are expensive, but we can't recover the cost of that through the market. And so certain types of long-term contracts can have that sort of deleterious impact. When that happens, let's fast forward. Let's say you're a power plant that's needed for reliability and you can no longer recover your costs in the market. What happens is sometimes the ISO New England, the grid operator says, okay, well, we really need that for reliability. We're concerned that if we don't have you for reliability, we're gonna have a problem. So they take you out of the market and they just give you the amount of money you need to run. And that is usually higher than the market price. So you have contracts for the preferred resource, and then you have a new contract for a power plant that's needed for reliability. Now, I can understand that markets can sometimes seem like abstract ideas. They're wholesale markets. There's hundreds of participants. They're worth millions of dollars. But the kinds of billions of dollars. But the kinds of issues that we're highlighting are not abstract. I think everyone is familiar with a power plant outside Boston, run normally on LNG, the Mystic Power Plant, which is, in full disclosure, owned by one of my members. That's a power plant that the ISO said that was not recovering its costs in the markets. And ISO New England said, you provide a very important need. We need you for reliability. And so now everyone in New England is paying an above market price for that. And everyone in this room who is involved in the markets can tell you that has been an expensive contract that ratepayers are all paying for. When this happens, you then have another contract that removes money from the market and drives prices down. So what I would caution is that what seems like a theoretical idea regarding long-term contracts, the impacts on markets, is that the more you put the pressure on the markets, the more you engage in long-term contracts, the more you risk regarding the very good work that's happening at the wholesale level. And just sort of a word of caution regarding ratepayers and long-term contracts. I'm here to represent the power plants, but as a matter of public policy, the markets were created, the ISO New England wholesale electricity markets were created to move risk from ratepayers onto private companies, onto private shareholders, onto those who invest in power plants. And the basic concept is still persuasive. The people with the best information and the most skin in the game, if you will, are the ones who should be taking on the risks associated with huge investments. So if you're going to be subsidizing certain types of plants for 20 years at a time, you're moving the risk away from private corporations and shareholders, and you're moving them onto the ratepayers. And the longer the contract, the more the risk you're putting on the ratepayer. So to the degree that you want to hedge risk on behalf of ratepayers, that makes sense. But the more you move, you want to be careful about, you want to think about unintended consequences regarding who's sharing what risk and how it interacts with the markets that are there for the whole purpose of moving the risk away from the people who have the least ability to actually make these decisions.
Is there anything, any language that's giving you specific heartburn?
Yes, the issue on page 2, line 14 or so, 14, 15, section 3, it says that the utilities shall issue RFPs, not may. Now, what happens after the RFP? An RFP can come in and it can be on its face a bad series of responses, but what if it's, maybe okay? What do you do then? It creates it creates enough confusion, I think, that you want to keep it may. In my understanding, and I would defer to the consumer advocate and the Department of Energy and the utilities, but my understanding is that the utilities have a lot of flexibility now that doesn't require that shall.
But isn't that already in law, section 3? So Senator Waters.
I saw that. I watched that interaction with great interest. My understanding is that the utilities now can enter into those long-term contracts, but it's a may, not a shall. We're less concerned about RECs. I should also say, renewable energy certificates are a different product than actual energy coming out of a power plant.
So Senator Waters also suggested the percentage of the facility load, but that, like you said, you're not interested in RECs.
So that's a really interesting point, and it was new to me this morning, so I don't want to get out over my skis a little bit. I think it's fair to say that the more constraints you're going to put on the people who need to, the more specific you are regarding how you want to structure your contract, the more flexibility and discretion you take away from people who are trying to meet it. And there are unintended consequences even around things like firm where, let's say you have a power plant that is, must run and must give it the power theoretically on paper to a ratepayer that is at a certain price. But what if the ratepayer could get the same product for less? 20 years is a long time. So when you say firm, you're saying everyone has, my understanding is that the power plant has to produce, but people have to buy it too. There has to be a counterparty to that contract.
Do you have recommendations for language other than the may?
Well, I don't think it seems to me that this bill is not necessary.
Oh.
But maybe that was too blunt.
No, I appreciate blunt. No, good. That's.
And I think it would be good. And so I'm happy to take back any questions and try to find, you want solutions and I'm sympathetic to that. I think that the question is, what problem are you trying to solve? And we can help you. I think there's a lot of people in this room who also are committed to solving that problem.
Really appreciate your testimony.
Sure.
Are there questions from the committee? Seeing none. Well done.
Thank you.
All right. Let's go in favor. All right. So Jason Stock with New Hampshire Timberland Association supports and wishes to speak.
Good morning. For the record, I'm Jason Stock. I'm the Executive Director of the New Hampshire Timberland Owners Association, and I will be very brief. We come today here before you to speak in favor of Senate Bill 54, and as the prime sponsor indicated, this is a work in progress. We would love to participate in that. Of interest to us, of course, is biomass. Biomass is a Class 3 renewable. It's also a local indigenous fuel, and I would say it's almost as firm. We'll use the term firm that's been bandied around. It's pretty firm. It's a baseload power, and we think state has a long history of biomass power generation in this day and age, where we've heard plenty of testimony today about volatility and external factors affecting our power markets. We see there's a potential role in this bill for bringing more homegrown power into play, providing some more of that baseload power. And we are sensitive to ratepayers and the cost to ratepayers. And what I would say there is, as we have said, in this context, if there's an opportunity to do this and thread that needle where we can provide that power, provide some of that baseload renewable power, and at the same time, particularly in today's power markets, provide some lower cost power, we'd be happy to participate. I'll conclude my testimony there. I am not a utility attorney nor expert, but we look to participate in any future discussions. Thank you.
Senator Waters with a question? Oh, I misinterpreted that deep breath. Any questions from the committee? Seeing none. Thank you very much, Jason.
Thank you.
And I think our final speaker is Sam Evans Brown. I believe you're with Clean Energy.
So I'm very aware that I'm the last one in a long hearing, so I will also try to be brief. I just want to emphasize that I've heard everything. This is a very complicated issue, and I've heard everything that everyone coming before has said. And while we are supportive of the bill as drafted, recognize that that this is a very, it's a needle that requires threading, and there are a lot of interested voices and a lot of smart folks. So I do look forward to trying to convene a group that can try to come up with compromise language that moves us forward. There was a question earlier that I think might be useful to address, which is, what is this bill trying to solve? Molly, I hope you don't. This is not meant to be in opposition to Molly's comments. The fact that I'm coming after her might make it seem like that, but I actually am very sympathetic to a lot of the concerns about shifting risk to ratepayers and undermining the markets that Molly has addressed. But the ISO New England markets are only 20 years old, is what I would say. The markets are younger than most of the power plants that they're dispatching and ensuring are being sent out in merit order. What I think we are seeing right now is that the market designs are out of sync with the technologies that are now available to reduce ratepayer costs. Particularly, the markets struggle with any type of generating asset that has very high capital costs and has no marginal costs, because the markets are designed around marginal rates. They were designed assuming that the power plants that they'd be dispatching have fuel, which many renewable generators don't. When you look at all around the region, how have the states responded to the new reality that renewable energy is the cheapest resource that you can build? They've approached that challenge by creating a new market structure, which is a competitive solicitation. A competitive RFP is a market. It's an auction. It's just a different market design. The fact that that market is sort of going around the regional ISO New England markets is a challenge that we have to deal with. And ISO New England is actively coming up with proposals for how they are going to confront that reality. I've actually got in my inbox the straw proposal for what's called a forward clean energy market that is attempting to combat exactly that challenge. So all of this is to say, what is the problem we're trying to solve? We are trying to capture for New Hampshire ratepayers the benefits of the massive amount of clean energy that is proposed in the region right now. So if you look at the ISO New England interconnection queue, if we focus on utility scale solar alone, there's almost a gigawatt of utility scale solar that has been proposed and is in the ISO New England interconnection queue within the state of New Hampshire. As things stand right now, because New Hampshire is the only state in the region that is not doing this type of competitive solicitation, the ratepayer benefits, if those projects are constructed, are going to flow to ratepayers in other states. So saying that we will also, saying that we are the only state that's not going to do this type of solicitation is a bit like unilateral disarmament, right? We're recognizing that there are concerns about the RFP structure. We're saying, okay, we're not going to do it, which means that everyone else is going to take advantage. I do think that there's a path forward for how we try to ensure that the ratepayer benefits of that low-cost renewable energy flows to New Hampshire ratepayers, and I'm looking forward to working with all the smart folks who went before me and figuring out what that is.
Senator Waters with the question.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thanks for your kind of succinct suggestions of what we need to look at and going forward. Let me get to one small point. I think I may have been mistaken about the shall and may in terms of existing statute. I've checked on that. But this is as much for you, Sam, as for others here, is that one, would it be feasible to address that issue about what we are saying in terms of the new issue about long-term contract, which is creating some of the heartburn? If on lines 15 and 16 on page 2, which is where the shall word is. I mean, there's other stuff we're going to deal with, the firm and all that thing, but on this one, if we had the electric distribution company shall issue requests for proposals, and then say, which may include multi-year power purchase agreements. So you'd say, you know, that you do need to do contracts for these classes, and you now have the flexibility. And I look back into page 1 where we're saying, okay, if you're going to try to do this, here's the PUC has to make sure that those long-term agreements don't create some of the problems that have been raised up. So I just want to throw that out there. So do you think that might be a way of, or does that kind of undo the whole bill itself?
Well, so what I'd say is that I would anticipate that if you were to get everyone in this room around another table and have us all sit down, the language that emerged might be very different from here. So rather than workshopping the language that we have in front of us,
I just wanted to find a convenient way to acknowledge that I think there's an issue there that I wasn't aware of.
And what I would say, I think the intent of this bill is, as drafted, is really to get the utilities to put out the request so that we can see the numbers. so that we can see what the price is. Because I think that folks will be shocked to see how low cost many of these resources are. Maine did a clean energy procurement in 2021, and the prices, the low price that came in was 2.8 cents per kilowatt hour, and the high price was 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour. And so, no, that's not firm generation. No, that's not, but it's a pretty killer price when we're paying 27 cents per kilowatt hour in the Unitil service territory. And so I think that's the bill. The intent of the bill as drafted is let's put out a trial balloon and let's see the price. And if the price is too good to pass up, then the PUC may approve those. And I think that's the principle here. But as I said, rather than workshopping the bill in front of us, I think that everyone who you've heard from should sit down and talk about it.
If I just may follow up kind of on your last point, previous to my question, that I do worry that, is it fair to say that New Hampshire should worry that, whatever we are calling markets and technology neutral, the fact is that the markets have been shaped for a long time by decisions made by federal and state governments about energy development, and that the reductions we've seen in increases in efficiency and the reductions in pollution have been because of federal standards on clean air, for sure. Anyways, I see a head shaking no, but the Clean Air Act has an EPA has something to do with the shift that's made in investment in power plants. But are we potentially in a situation where, given the requirements for renewable energy coming out of Massachusetts, are they up to 11 to 18 gigawatts? That we might see that developments, say, of offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine, anywhere elsewhere, that all that power might actually flow to other states rather than to New Hampshire?
So what I'm suggesting here is that when all the other states have said we are going to issue RFPs and sign PPAs, they're essentially all the new generation that's coming on. If what we're saying is we need to build new generation because this is how we've gotten ourselves into the situation, is by retiring old power plants and not building new ones. All the new generation that's coming online is going to have their output locked up in other states. And what is New Hampshire's response to that?
Right.
Thank you.
So my question is, how do I get everybody in this room that agrees, that's neutral, and that disagrees to help move something forward so that we can lower some energy costs? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, we're all here. Perhaps we can circle up once the microphone has been turned off and find a time that everyone's available.
Yeah, I would like to see something done, and even if it's baby steps, we got to do something. And so that being said, any further questions from the committee? No. Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. Just because I like you, Josh. Any further comments? Just like brief?
I don't think I have anything else to add.
Thank you for saying
answer.
All right. And thank you all and for all your patience and for the people who are waiting on the next bill. So with that, we're going to close the hearing on SB 54. Thank you, everybody, for contributing to the conversation. And we're going to hear from the prime sponsor of SB 56. And I recognize, when you are ready, Senator Waters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, Senator David Waters, District 4, introducing Senate Bill 56, relative payments for upland resource losses. This bill, just a little background, came request from the department, and you'll see Commissioner Scott's letter to that effect. And Senator Bradley wanted us to get this out right away before it had gone out for co-sponsorship. So here it is, just by my name, but I don't want to take credit for that, or that other people who would have co-sponsored surely would have signed on. But what this is needed to do is, if you gaze upon RSA 42A, which basically is the statute that deals with mitigation of wetlands and other wetland resources in terms of development, this needs to provide some more flexibility in this bill as to what natural areas would qualify for payment in lieu of direct mitigation. So, developer comes forward, the development project requires that some wetland areas that are governed under 482 may need to be taken for that project. Then we have this process where we do mitigation, that whether it's on the site, there's some acreage or areas, natural areas that can essentially replace what's being lost. Now, the issue here is that definitionally, some of the upland resources that are connected to those shoreland and wetland sources are impacted, and the developer would have no option of using the payment in lieu of mitigation. And so what the bill says is that that makes some sense, that we just need to change this. We have a more inclusive definition, so a developer can make that payment rather than be stalled out because they can't find a way to directly mitigate at that place. The land needs to be mitigated. So we have behind us someone from the department who can get a lot more into it, but that's the kind of snapshot, is that this will help facilitate protecting these areas, but also mean the development can occur when it can use this option. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Any questions from the committee? Seeing none? Oh, no. All right, good.
Yep.
So with that, I'd like to hear from Gary Abbott, Associated General Contractors, in opposition.
Thank you very much, Chairman Avard, Senators. Glad to see you again. I just wanted, my name is Gary Abbott. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Associated General Contractors. On Friday, I started out like your other hearings, neutral on Friday when I first read the bill. Then I distributed it to some of my members for comments on the bill because I had a lot of trouble interpreting what this bill actually did. And so I got a lot of phone calls over the weekend that I really wasn't expecting on a holiday weekend. They tried to fill me in on what this bill does from a private developer or contractor applying for a permit. I think it's important for you to understand where we're at with the wetland regulations. Currently, under the law, if a contractor or development has to impact the wetlands, they have to mitigate it. And one of their options is to pay into the in lieu fee fund called the ARM fund. That's an option, and it's a calculation. Over time, it had been put in the statute, very similar to this. It's a separate part of 482A. You can look at it, and it grows interest-wise over time. And so when a contractor is going to impact, say I'm going to take 2 acres of a wetlands, and that's part of the process, and I can't mitigate it, I'll pay into the fund. So there's a calculation and a formula and a payment amount. Now, you recognize that me as the developer, I'm going to impact the buffer zone or the setback that is jurisdictional under this bill. That's kind of talking about. We don't compensate for that currently. That is exempt. We compensate for the wetland. It's a delineated process, certified wetland. People delineate it so we know what the square footage is. This bill opens up that now it's going to have a part 2. I'm going to pay for that, where I currently don't pay for the impact going up to it, because clearly, if I'm filling in 2 acres, I'm affecting the setback area. This adds, so quickly I found out, and you know, you can understand developers and contractors going, I got to pay another fee, another charge, another calculation on those square footage of that setback area. So it started to make me understand, okay, now I get it. I'll be paying the old fee, which we thought covered the setback area that we had for years. Now, my understanding is, and what I found through this information, again, it's secondhand information. I don't want to come to you with the understanding that everything all of my members said to me over the weekend was absolute. But they brought up there was a case in 2021, one of the applicants was charged for these setback areas. and appealed it and won the appeal and did not have to pay over $100,000 that the department wanted to charge. So we're looking at it as a brand-new fee, and it's kind of in here as a change, but it really is charging for something that we currently don't charge for. It also raises then a whole bunch of questions. There's been legislation over the years to change the definition of prime wetlands, because that has a 100-foot setback. If those change, it could be a broader area, it could be more. Setbacks could be changed in the future. What this calculation is on, then you kind of go to, why is it a separate fund? The current mitigation fund, when I pay for that 2 acres of wetlands, it is used for buying uplands.
Repeat that, it's used for what?
It can be used for purchasing uplands as a mitigation. So the department collects the funds and has been in the past purchasing uplands with that funds. Uplands was never separated out, that if a portion was uplands, it went to uplands, and the actual wetlands went to making new wetlands. No, the money went into a fund for the department to figure out through a grant process how to allocate that money for future mitigation. So there's some confusion there that uplands has been part of the mitigation package. It's just this new calculation. So it's a new cost. We want to bring that up. There's new variables and there's new definitions, which I'm sitting here today saying, I believe it applies to tidal setbacks and prime wetlands, but I don't know if it applies to local setbacks that may be implemented. I don't know how far reaching this is. It says jurisdictional, but we have a little fuzzy area here with some local regulations and some state regulations. So I'm not really clear on the separation of the fund, the definitions that are in here. So that's why I started out on Friday that I had some concerns, but the more information I got, I found this is a new policy. This is what you'll be deciding of whether it's a new policy. Now, I recognize that maybe, and I heard through the weekend that DOT and others may be in favor of this, but they're kind of a different than a private developer or landowner who's developing their property, in the sense that they have a memorandum of agreement between DES and them to negotiate on those larger projects. But I don't want the private sector to come under play. I'm also throwing out there that I'm taking this position just based on that quick feedback that I got. I still need to go through I know you heard this in others, I need to go through the policy question with my board of directors and my appropriate committees. But the quick knee-jerk reaction, I know, standing in front of my board of directors saying, are you okay with this new charge or fee? I probably won't get a very welcoming response.
How many people, contractors does this affect?
I represent about 40 general contractors, about 60 subcontractors, and a number of consultants, who mainly I went out to are consultants who do this work. I view them as the experts who represent developers and contractors who go through the process for their quick feedback to get to this. So I wanted to bring that up, that just, it was a hard bill to read exactly what we're doing, but it is a policy question.
Senator Waters with a question?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thanks, Gary. So, I mean, we're going to hear some more from the department, which may answer some of your questions, but I do hope that you'll look very closely at the language in the bill, where what it's saying is restoration or enhancement of any jurisdictional area under RSA 42A, which is what we're already doing. And then if you look at definitions in A4, it tells you just what those areas are. So I do think that perhaps there is clarification here, which in the rush of things, I do hope you take a close look, because it's very hard for me to see how what you're describing is actually something that's a new fee or so on and so forth. I think it's a new option,
yep,
but I don't see it as a new fee or the grabbing more land to cover, because the definitions are right there in A4.
But thank you, Senator, for the question. I appreciate the question and always willing to work with you. But I struggled with setting the fee at $65,000 per acre. Uplands are looked at in most mitigation that the ratio of, there's a far bigger ratio of, if I fill in a wetland and do 1 acre, you have to save like 10 acres of uplands to equal the mitigation. And I'm struggling with the valuation if we're going to separate these two things going in the future. I also want to look at what we've been paying, maybe, as I think it opens a lot of discussion that hasn't been there. It may be listed as those things that are jurisdictional in the sense that the fund can pay. I guess I really looked hard. That first paragraph about enhancement and restoration is about where the fund can pay out. It's a little different than what we're being asked to pay for mitigation or mitigate. So most of the time contractors are trying to keep out of, if they're not going to touch the wetlands and there's a setback, contractors can do everything they can to keep out of the setback, not to have any issues. But
I think we're gonna hear some more answers in the next testimony.
well,
to some
and
of
I
these
tried to
things, but
get here
yeah,
and sign
we'll
up
see.
late to be last, but it looks like I was not last.
No, you weren't.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And any further questions? Seeing none. All right, Kevin, DOT.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, Kevin Nyan, and I manage the Environmental Office at the Department of Transportation. And I am here to speak on behalf of the department in favor of the bill as it's written for a number of reasons. First, the statute RSA 42A does apply to aquatic resources, protection of aquatic resources, wetlands. Uplands in general, it does not protect, but it does protect uplands that are associated with those aquatic resources. So for example, sand dunes, undisturbed tidal buffer zones, and those types of resources, and they are articulated in the statute as being protected. Currently, there is part of the statute that allows, in lieu of, we call it permittee responsible mitigation, which is where the department would go out and look for another mitigation project to offset our impacts. There, for aquatic resources and shorelines, there is a mechanism in the Aquatic Resource Mitigation Fund, excuse me, an in lieu fee. And that's stipulated in statute 42A, and it identifies the cost of that. Mr. Abbott alluded to, is $65,000 an acre. So that's in statute. And I think it's the department's opinion that not being able to mitigate losses of other jurisdictional areas besides the aquatic resources with an ARM fund payment is really an oversight, because the statute does apply to those protected kind of upland resources, sand dunes, tidal buffer zones. So not being able to mitigate a project impact with an ARM fund payment for the department does have real effect on us. So the process of securing permittee responsible mitigation is timely. So by looking for a separate project. So I'm going to use our Hampton Harbor Bridge project as an example. The project is scheduled to go out and advertise for construction later in 2023, early 24. We had presumed all along the availability of that ARM fund payment, as you'll see in the letter, working with the department, $318,000. Without the ability to make an ARM fund payment simply as an option, as Senator Waters alluded to, really does have the potential to delay that construction project so that we can instead find another permittee responsible mitigation. So because the statute does apply to all these resources, aquatic resources, upland, undisturbed tidal buffer zones, and sand dunes, we view this as simply something that's providing just another option. It's not really a policy change, as I've heard. It really is another option for us to mitigate our wetland losses. And without it, it does put us behind the 8 ball, not only on our short-term projects with the Hampton Harbor Bridge, but also for future projects, because as a department, we like to put the money in the hands of the folks that do those projects most efficiently and more routinely, and that is environmental services. So with that, conclude that the department is in support of this bill, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Senator Waters for the question.
Yeah, thank you. And I think this might also be for Darlene when she gets up here too. So, and thank you. And I will say, I kind of see it the way you see it, and it is an existing amount, but I also hear what Gary Abbott's saying about anxieties here. So my question to you and to Darlene is going to be, if we rewrote this to say that this applies to state projects, would that thread the needle that you do what you got to do, and it would kind of bracket out the larger question of what do we do for the private contractors, so we get something done without having to open every can of worms in every wetland?
So thank you for the question. I can only, as a state agency, I can speak from the perspective of the state agency, is that if you read this bill as a policy change, then it matters. But if you read this simply as the ability already exists in the statute to collect mitigation and do mitigation for those uplands that are associated with the aquatic resources, sand dunes, tidal buffer zones, all this bill does is provide another option for mitigation. So that's the way we view it. I guess I would leave it up to your specific question up to the Department of Environmental Services to answer with respect to private development. But the way that we read this, I don't want to call it a cleanup bill, but it does provide an applicant with more flexibility.
Well, that's the way I saw it, but on the other hand, you know, there are questions that could come up. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Questions? Senator Bertzel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for taking my question. So let me just try and understand this. I think the concerns of Mr. Abbott was that we are charging the contractors are thinking they're being charged an additional amount of money. Is this bill just allowing the department to access the money in the fund for the upland area, not charging the contractors additional $65,000?
So thank you for your question. The bill does not deal with accessing the money after it's been paid into the mitigation fund. The bill does look at the resources that we as applicants would impact as part of construction and prescribes a formula to paying for those losses under certain conditions. So when you reach a threshold, then it triggers the mitigation. And so this bill says, okay, for upland resources, which are protected under RSA 42A, prime wetland buffers, tidal buffer zones, sand dunes, it provides that the same mechanism for mitigation that we have on the aquatic resources, wetlands, streams, shorelines, and those types of things. So, so I don't know if I answered your question, but it really deals with the payment or the option to make a payment into the ARM fund in lieu of doing our own project. So for example, for our Hampton Harbor Bridge project, the mitigation, the value of the mitigation based on our impacts on sand dunes and tidal buffer zones is $318,000 roughly. Without the ability to make that ARM fund payment for those lost resources, we would have to work with nonprofits or other folks to identify another area that we could spend $318,000 working with them to build another project, to do sand dune restoration and sand dune creation. That is something that we feel, especially where we are in the project development process, is better suited to be done by the Department of Environmental Services by paying them that $318,000. And they take that money and they've got a process to award grants and contracts for that. And so this is just simply, in our minds, an option. So it doesn't add, from our perspective, any new policy in terms of what we need to impact, what we need to mitigate, just how we mitigate it. Sorry for that long-winded answer to your question. I hope I answered it.
Senator Pearl.
trying to think of how to get my head around exactly what this is doing here. I spent many years on the zoning board learning about vernal pools, so it was a little bit of a flashback to that. I'm almost looking at this as it creates a pay-to-play situation where you're better off, it maybe, and I'll throw this to Gary too, it may almost come out that you're better off as a contractor to just pay a fee rather than try and mitigate, because at times it's a known quantity, and when you start down these mitigation projects, I've seen them balloon way out of control in cost. And I guess the real question I'll ask is, once you've, right now, we currently have this in place for the wetland itself.
Yes.
Once you take that wetland and you've paid that fee and it's no longer considered a wetland, is the buffer zone even in play anymore as a buffer zone? Because theoretically, by definition, once you remove the wetland, then the buffer zone wouldn't exist.
Thank you for your question. So number one, we agree with you in terms of the option to make a payment is far easier on this applicant than having to do our own mitigation. So number one, we totally agree with you. On the second question, I would have to defer to Darlene, but you're right. I would say you're right. When you impact the wetland, or after you've impacted the wetland, and there's no more wetland, there's no more buffer. But until you do that, there is a buffer there when you speak specifically to certain types of wetlands.
Well,
I don't know.
So I guess I would say, and looking at it as I understand it now, it really is a matter of, and I'm sure Darlene will be able to help clarify, of what is DES allowed to accept mitigation for now?
Mm-hmm.
And if the answer is wetlands and certain protected uplands, then this really is a question of just an option for another form of mitigation. But if the question is, does DES have the ability to accept any mitigation for upland resource losses, such as sand dunes, then this is a question of policy. And the Department of Transportation, just on past practice and working, as the largest impactor and mitigator in the state, it's not a question of policy.
is it a new fee?
Is it a new fee?
Yeah, I heard the word fee earlier.
In lieu, so it's an in lieu fee. So you make a payment or a fee payment in lieu of doing other forms of mitigation. So is it a new fee? I would say no. The mechanism for mitigating this type of impact has always been there. It's just not articulated right now for certain upland resource losses.
Senator Waters brought up the proposal of it applies to state projects only. Could you just elaborate a little bit on that? If we were to adopt that, where would we go with that?
So from the perspective of the Department of Transportation, I'd say that solves our problem. But I would leave it up to others to make the decision on private.
That solves your problem?
If you only apply it to the state, yeah. Solves the Department of Transportation's problem, yeah. But I would again, I would still reiterate that I don't believe this is a question of policy. I believe it's a question of options for something that already exists.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just, it's sinking in.
Sure, no, I got you. Sure. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, follow up.
So I think that the third part of it, you said there was, you were highlighting the part that is, there's two questions. I think there's a third part is, the real question is currently, is DES allowed to require upland mitigation when you've mitigated a wetland? That's the real.
So that's the policy question.
That's
I think you've
where
hit,
this
sir.
could become a policy question.
And in past practice and reading of the statute and the way we've always done it, the answer is yes.
Okay.
Okay, further questions? Seeing none. Thank you very much for your testimony. Darlene? Okay. We already exec one. We can maybe do my 40 after, if we take time. All right, how you doing?
Fine, how are you?
All right, welcome.
let the gentleman pass these out. That is the written testimony for the Department of Environmental Services. My name is Darlene Forrest. Those of you who know me as a Shoreline Section Supervisor, I am now the Wetlands Bureau Administrator and thus get the honor of testifying on this bill. So let me just back up. Short version, the department supports this legislation because we believe it provides options to people who would not otherwise have the option of the in lieu fee requirement. So I'm going to back up and provide some history in anticipation of some questions. The mitigation requirement for impacts is set by rule and not by law. Jurisdiction is set by law. Wetlands Bureau's jurisdiction and what we regulate is not going to expand to a town-adopted ordinance or anything else. We are empowered by the state to do a certain amount of regulation within a certain jurisdiction. No one else can empower DES, just the state. That said, in RSA 482A, we have jurisdiction over freshwater and freshwater and tidal wetlands, freshwater and tidal surface waters. The law also specifies that we have jurisdiction over sand dunes, so specific to the coastal area. We also have a 100-foot tidal buffer zone. The only other area of uplands that would come into jurisdiction would be there are 8 to 11 towns that when they adopted their prime wetlands, there was an option for a 100-foot prime wetland buffer. Those towns chose to add that buffer when they designated their prime wetland. It is no longer in the statute. No town can adopt a new buffer unless you folks vote to change the statute. Those are the only jurisdictional uplands that we're talking about here. Wetlands has required mitigations for impacts to those jurisdictional uplands since the late 90s. The in lieu fee option did not become available until the early 2000s. So the reason for this, backing up again, the reason for the mitigation is EPA has a policy of no net loss. If you want to qualify for the federal GP, the Army Corps state-issued general permit, which lets contractors not have to go get an individual permit for the Corps, they can piggyback. The Corps reviews the state permit, they okay our permit. The Corps has to meet EPA's national intent of no net loss of functions and values. That is applied across our jurisdiction. Again, we don't have to require mitigation. It just means we won't be able to allow the folks in New Hampshire to take advantage of the general permit. So that is a long-standing federal requirement. It is a long-standing service that we have provided to contractors and landowners in New Hampshire. The in lieu fee option came later, and the reason was it is very difficult to find permittee responsible mitigation. It is very difficult for an applicant who has a project that they know they want to do to then go find another project that will offset the loss of functions and values of the resources that they've that they're impacting, whether it's flood storage, wildlife habitat, nutrient attenuation. There's a list of 12 of them. You'll find them in the definition section of the statute that are of particular concern. So what the in lieu fee option does is instead of the applicant themselves needing to go out and locate property if they cannot do it on the property of their project, rather than that applicant needing to go find another property where they can either create a restoration or enhancement project or preserve a buffer around a wetland that has these same functions and values that would help to offset the losses associated with their project, they could pay into a fee, and the state of New Hampshire manages that fee as a grant dispersal fund where others can, who have a project, who've been looking for a way to fund it, can dip into that fund and replace those functions and values. The hardest part about mitigation is hooking up the person with the project that has impacts with the person who has an idea and knows where there's an opportunity to offer mitigation. Those two parties do exist out there. You just don't usually find them in the same room. The mitigation fund allows that to happen. It's a facilitating function. The case that was mentioned, we have been charging as a state, when the in lieu fee program came in, it was extremely popular right from the outset. And we applied it to all projects. And we can show where there are in lieu fee payments that DES accepted on behalf of applicants for upland jurisdictional impacts as early as, the earliest one I saw was 2005. There was a case this past year in 2021, gosh, I guess it's 2 years ago now, where an applicant in the Seacoast who was impacting tidal buffer challenged whether or not they should have to make a mitigation payment. They challenged this on the grounds that a prior rule set, and there are things within the rule set, had said that developed tidal buffer should not be considered priority. It's a golf course. They decided it was developed tidal buffer. In the long run, we agreed with them. The council did not overturn this decision. We reached an agreement that a golf course is development. Therefore, because it is developed tidal buffer is one of those upland resource areas that's mentioned in the statute, we would not generally consider that a major impact project. If it was undeveloped tidal buffer, and it was still an area that might see, it might become available as a release point for sea level rise or some other mitigating factor, we would consider it major. Undeveloped, no. I'm sorry, developed, no. So it was a very specific thing to a very specific case, and it's unfortunate that we're having this after a 3-day weekend because we probably would have had a chance to clarify this with other parties, but oh well, things happened late on a Friday. So this is not new policy. These things exist now. If you choose to add the language that says this is only available to state agencies, DOT will be quite happy. No one else really does that much building, but DOT will be quite happy because this will facilitate their use of this option. It will not be available to any other contractor who is still currently susceptible to having to do permittee responsible mitigation. Please note, this is the reason that not many contractors have experienced this is because it is specific to those 11 towns that have prime wetland buffers and the Seacoast region. Not every contractor is going to have experience there. So, and again, that's also what this is going to affect. In those 11 towns, 8 to 11 towns, we'll go with the high number, and the Seacoast region, you are making this option available. Again, we thought it was available in the past. We can actually print the records because we do have those records of where we've done this in the past to show that this is not new. We've been doing it. We can print the old rule sets that talk about mitigation and when it is required. Happy to do so if that provides confidence and background. But this is not new policy. It is the extension of an option. It does not create a new fund. It goes into the there's only one ARM fund. There is no other ARM fund. There's only one ARM fund, but we did want to make it clear that if you are paying in on an upland resource, such as a sand dune, which is the vast majority of what this particular upcoming DOT project will impact, that you will have the ability to procure a grant to do work in a sand dune, to restore sand dunes or improve sand dunes in the coastal region, which in the coastal region are in fact very important to some of these towns because they're helping, again, to buffer some of these storm events. So I would offer that, and if anyone has any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
Senator Waters.
Yeah, I'll just suggest, and thank you, Ms. Forst, for your explanation. It really helps. But I would suggest that the situation we're in is that if you and Mr. Nyan can talk to Mr. Abbott, and I mean, I kind of think we're okay, but if we're not, we have the default of just saying for the state for now, and then see if we can do, see where we are later. But I have a feeling that it gets talked through. Maybe you could give us a high sign that we're going to be okay. But well, if that's okay with you three, that would maybe help us out.
Well, I don't mind talking to Gary, but if I have to talk to Kevin.
It goes along with the name.
Does,
All right.
do you have a time frame that you're, that you need that
a week?
response?
A week from now? That'd be okay? All right, great. Seeing no further questions, we're going to close the hearing. Is there a motion to move into exec? And all in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Seeing none, I would like to entertain my bill, SB 40. And I definitely would entertain a motion to pass.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Discussion. I like it.
So, Mr. Chairman, could we add then just this phrase on line 12?
And only?
Yeah, and then insert only such a hydroelectric generator.
All right, Nick, you got that?
Oh, you said line 12 or 10? Line 12. So where it starts to go bold, and only such a hydroelectric generator shall be. Okay?
Senator Waters, I don't see the necessity of it.
I don't either, but
if you read the sentence,
Yeah.
such a hydroelectric generator shall be eligible to participate.
Yeah, I know.
And shall be eligible as a customer generator as a matter of law without I mean, it's kind of already there.
Well,
I'm not opposed to it if you feel it
I don't know what to say. I agree, the way I read it, and as I explained to Mr. Elliott, that if you look at the such a hydroelectric, it refers to everything before, and so, but if they're really so worried about the camel's nose
Yeah.
under the tent, I'm just trying to anticipate how hard their objection will be. I mean, I don't agree with their premise, but I'm just, if this would be a
Belt and suspenders.
clarification, but I don't, I don't know. I don't know where we're at.
This is a simple change. I won't oppose it for
Right,
that. It
right.
just seems redundant.
Nick, can you read that back to us real quick, just where the change is?
So on the first page, line 12, I have generating capacity and only such a hydroelectric generator shall be eligible as a customer generator. Yeah, only such a hydroelectric generator.
Yep.
That's fine.
Thank
All
you.
in favor of the changes?
Aye.
Okay, any opposed? Seeing none. Further discussion?
Move on to pass as amended.
Second by Senator Pearl. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Seeing none. And is there a motion to pass completely? Or do we just do the whole thing?
I'll move consent.
Consent. Is there a second?
I'll second.
All in favor of consent?
Aye.
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 Any opposed?
So, Mr. Chairman, is there a way that Senate Bill 12, where Senator Altshuler is now here, that we can reconsider that and put it on the consent calendar?
That's up to Senator Altshuler. If you would like to have another bill put on consent with your approval.
Who's taking out 40?
I am.
I'm sorry, which one was that?
12.
That was the seasonal camp lots by Fish and Game Department?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, I'll
so-
move reconsideration on my motion on 12.
I'll second.
Seconded by Senator Pearl. All in favor of reconsideration?
Aye.
Any opposed? Sorry, is there a motion?
I'll move on to pass.
I'll second.
By Senator Pearl, seconded. All in favor ought to pass.
Aye.
Any opposed? Seeing none, is there a motion for
Move
consent?
consent.
Senator Waters moves to consent.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Seeing none. Okay, I think that's it for executing today.
Move out of exec.
Is there a second? All in favor of moving out of exec?
Aye.
Any opposed? Seeing none. Thank you very much for all your hard work. We are dismissed. Yep. Well done, committee.
First off, I want to give you a heads up that this was delayed in ORS. This is the title of the bill.
Okay.
Okay. I'm going to release it today. You'll have it tomorrow for potential postponement.
Yeah, I'll postpone.
And what it does is it basically says is that
Josh Elliott is just gonna walk.
it says we,
Yeah, I need a minute.
it sets the context for studying this.
And then, I'll send you all the
Taxi.
and then